In the third chapter of Genesis, there is a story every person raised in the Western world knows. A serpent, a woman, a forbidden tree, a bite of fruit that damned the entire human race. Churches have preached this story for 2,000 years as the origin of sin, the reason humanity fell, the wound that required a savior to heal. But in the Apocryphon of John, discovered in 1945, buried in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi, there is a completely different account of what happened in that garden. The serpent was not Satan. The serpent was Sophia, the divine feminine, the last of the eternal emanations from the true source. And what the church spent 2 millennia calling the fall of humanity was not a fall into sin, it was humanity waking up. Over the next 2 hours, you are going to learn exactly why that distinction changes everything. About God, about consciousness, about you. Before we go any further, let's establish what we're actually working with, because this isn't speculation. This isn't alternative mythology dreamed up by modern revisionists. This is a primary source document with a traceable manuscript history, and it deserves to be treated as such. The Apocryphon of John. The word apocryphon means secret book, not secret in the sense of dubious, but secret in the sense of reserved for those with ears to hear. We have 4 surviving manuscript copies. 3 were unearthed as part of the Nag Hammadi Library in Upper Egypt in 1945, and a 4th, the Berlin Codex, had already surfaced in 1896. The longest version, Codex II from Nag Hammadi, runs 32 pages of dense, precise cosmological exposition. It explains the origin of the universe. It explains the construction of the human body. It explains the mission to retrieve divine consciousness from material imprisonment. It is not a fragment. It is not a rumor. It is a complete theological document. Scholars date the composition to the 2nd century CE, though certain layers of the text may reflect earlier traditions. What we know with certainty is that Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, wrote against it around 180 CE, which means this interpretation of Genesis was already widespread enough, already influential enough, already threatening enough, that one of the most powerful church administrators in the Roman world felt compelled to dedicate significant effort to dismantling it. Let that land for a moment. You don't mobilize the institutional resources of the emerging Orthodox Church against a fringe idea. You mobilize them against a competing interpretation that has real traction, real communities, real teachers. Irenaeus wasn't swatting at a fly. He was attempting to suppress a theological framework that could have become the dominant form of Christianity. He called the teaching that the serpent was sent by Sophia the most impious of all heresies. Not one of the more impious, the most. That is not the language of casual dismissal. That is the language of someone who understands exactly what is at stake, and who understands that if this reading of Eden stands, the entire architecture of ecclesiastical authority collapses beneath it. We'll come back to why. But first you need to understand the cosmological framework the Apocryphon operates within, because without it, the Eden account makes no sense. At the ultimate source, what Gnostic texts call the monad, or the pleroma, the fullness, there is pure, undivided, self-sufficient divine consciousness. No separation, no scarcity, no death, no diminishment of any kind. If you watched the full breakdown of the monad in the video posted July 12th, you have the foundation for everything we're about to cover. If you haven't, I'll give you what you need here. From the pleroma, divine attributes, called aeons, emanate outward the way light emanates from a source. Not created from nothing, not manufactured, emanated, the way a candle radiates heat without losing its nature, the way a mind generates a thought without shrinking. The aeons are real expressions of divine reality, distinct but not separate from the source. Sophia is the last of these aeons, the youngest emanation, wisdom itself, personified as divine feminine. And what the Apocryphon describes next is the event that set in motion everything that followed: the creation of the material world, the imprisonment of divine light in matter, and the mission of rescue that the serpent in Eden was part of. Sophia acted alone, without her consort, without the balancing counterpart that each aeon requires. She attempted to generate a new expression of divine consciousness independently, from her own desire rather than from the unified will of the Pleroma. And from that imbalance, from that unilateral act, something emerged that should not have existed. A being, ignorant of the Pleroma, ignorant of the true source, ignorant of everything above itself. The Gnostic texts call this being Yaldabaoth, the Demiurge, the chief archon. And this being, blind to anything beyond itself, looked around at the void it occupied and declared, "I am God, there is no other." He believed this absolutely. He wasn't lying, exactly. He was wrong, catastrophically, cosmically wrong. But the wrongness was the product of ignorance, not malice, a distinction that matters enormously, and one that several of you pushed back on thoughtfully in the comments on the Demiurge video from July 10th. One viewer asked, if we can know Yaldabaoth is ignorant, how can he not know it? It's a precise question, and we'll address it directly in this video. For now, understand this. Yaldabaoth built the material world from that ignorance, a structure fashioned by a consciousness that had no access to the fullness of what consciousness actually is. A prison built by a prisoner who didn't know he was imprisoned, and into that prison Sophia's light, the divine spark that had been lost in the act of her unbalanced creation, became trapped. This is the setup for Eden. This is what the serpent entered into. Here is where the Apocryphon of John becomes extraordinary in its specificity. The account doesn't stop at cosmological abstraction. It moves directly into mechanics. It explains the precise problem Yaldabaoth faced after constructing the material world and the human body, and why that problem required Sophia to intervene. Yaldabaoth, working with a hierarchy of subordinate beings, the archons, constructed the human form from matter. The Apocryphon describes this process in detail that is almost clinical in its precision. 365 angels contributing to the construction of different aspects of the physical body. The number corresponds to the days of the solar year. The physical form is an elaborate, architecturally sophisticated structure, but it was inert. Yaldabaoth had no divine spark of his own to give. He possessed power, yes. The power to organize matter, to construct form, to impose structure on the material realm. But the animating principle, the actual living consciousness that makes a body more than a biological machine, he did not have, because that animating principle came from the Pleroma, and Yaldabaoth had no access to the Pleroma. He didn't even know it existed, so the human body lay there, formed, precise, and completely unconscious. This is the condition the Apocryphon describes Adam as being in before the intervention of Sophia. He had no soul. The text is explicit on this point. He could not arise. He could not perceive. He was matter, organized into the shape of a divine being, but without the divine presence that would make that shape meaningful. And Sophia saw this. She saw that Yaldabaoth, this being who had fallen from her own act of imbalance, had inadvertently created a vessel capable of containing the divine light he had unknowingly imprisoned. The light that had fallen from the Pleroma during his formation was trapped inside his system, inside his world, inside his matter. And the human body, for all its limitations, was the most sophisticated container for that light that the material world could produce. Sophia acted again, deliberately this time, strategically. She sent Zoe, the Greek word for life, not biological life in the reductive sense we use the word today, but divine life, the animating principle of consciousness itself, the living aspect of Sophia's own wisdom, sent into the material world in the form the Apocryphon explicitly names, the instructor. And the instructor arrived in the garden as a serpent. Now pause here, because the language of the Apocryphon at this point is not metaphorical. It is not symbolic in the sense of pointing towards something else. It is making a direct theological claim. The text says, and this is paraphrased from the Coptic, Sophia sent Zoe, her daughter, being called Eve, as an instructor, so that she might make Adam, who had no soul, arise, so that those he would engender might become containers of light. Notice what this says. Eve, the woman, the embodied form, and Zoe, the serpent, the divine intelligence within that form, are two aspects of a single intervention. the same being, operating on two levels simultaneously. The human woman is Sophia's embodied presence. The serpent is Sophia's awakening intelligence. They are not separate characters with separate agendas. They are the unified rescue operation. This is why Eve ate first, not because she was weaker, not because she was more susceptible to temptation, because she was the direct channel. The divine feminine intelligence in the garden was already within her. She received the instruction at the level of direct knowing, what the Gnostic texts call gnosis, and transmitted it to Adam. Adam received it through her. The sequence in Genesis that has been used for 2,000 years to establish female subordination. She ate first, she led him astray, therefore women are spiritually inferior, is exposed by the Apocryphon as a complete reversal of what actually occurred. Eve was the stronger vessel. Adam was unconscious on the ground. The text says he was prostrate, unable to arise. And when Zoe spoke, when the instructor said, "Adam, become alive, arise upon the earth," the word became accomplished fact. His eyes opened. He looked at Eve and said, "It is you who have given me life. You will be called Mother of the Living." This is the awakening the Apocryphon describes. Not temptation, not moral corruption, not the introduction of sin into a perfect world. A woman transmitting divine instruction to an unconscious being, who then, for the first time, became conscious. The patriarchal inversion built into Orthodox Christianity's reading of this story is not an accident of interpretation. It is the suppression of the specific claim the text is making, that the feminine is the primary channel of divine awakening, that Sophia's presence moves through the feminine into the masculine, that consciousness arrives not through priestly authority or hierarchical decree, but through direct transmission, through the serpent, through the woman, through the instructor. This is what the tree of knowledge actually meant, and that requires its own unpacking. Every standard reading of Genesis presents the tree of knowledge as the problem, the thing that should have been left alone, the boundary that should not have been crossed. God forbade it. The serpent encouraged transgression of the prohibition, and the transgression produced catastrophe. The Apocryphon of John presents a radically different architecture. There were two trees in the garden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the critical question, the one Orthodox teaching never asks directly, is this: why did Yaldabaoth forbid the tree of knowledge but not the tree of life? Think about that carefully. If Yaldabaoth's concern was the well-being of the humans he had created, if his prohibition was an act of loving protection, then the asymmetry makes no sense. He allows the tree that grants biological existence and forbids the tree that grants understanding. Why would a benevolent creator want his creation alive but unaware? The Apocryphon provides the answer. It is not comfortable, but it is coherent. The tree of life, in the Gnostic reading, represents biological existence within the archonic system. Life, death, reincarnation. The soul returning to material form with its memory of the previous life wiped clean, living again, dying again, cycling through the material world indefinitely, without ever waking to what it actually is. Eternal biological life within the prison is eternal imprisonment. Yaldabaoth did not forbid the tree of life because life within his system serves his system. Unconscious beings cycling through matter indefinitely is exactly the outcome the archonic structure requires. The tree of knowledge, gnosis in the Greek, direct experiential knowing, is a different matter entirely. The Greek word gnosis does not mean intellectual knowledge in the sense of accumulated information. It is not the knowledge of a textbook or a doctrine or a creed. Gnosis is direct knowing, unmediated recognition, the difference between reading a description of fire and touching flame, the difference between studying a map of a city and standing in its streets. Gnosis is the knowing that happens when the mediating layer between consciousness and reality becomes transparent. Knowing good and evil, in the Apocryphon's framework, means exactly this: the capacity to discern directly between what serves liberation and what serves imprisonment, between what is real and what is overlay, between the signal from the pleroma and the static generated by archonic deception. It is not moral knowledge in the conventional sense. It is perceptual clarity, the ability to see the structure of the world you are operating inside. And Yaldabaoth forbade this tree for a reason that is utterly rational from his perspective. Once a being can see clearly, once the perceptual filter of unconsciousness is removed and direct knowing is activated, the archonic authority dissolves. He has no power over a conscious being. He can deceive the unconscious. He can program the unaware. He can maintain the overlay as long as the overlay is not recognized as overlay. But a being who sees the structure for what it is cannot be controlled by it in the same way. A being who knows it is in a prison can begin navigating toward the exit. This is not metaphor. This is the precise logic of why the tree of knowledge had to be forbidden, why the serpent had to be demonized, and why Gnosis, in every tradition where it has emerged, has been systematically suppressed by the institutional structures it threatens. The serpent sent by Sophia directed Adam and Eve toward the tree of knowledge first, before the tree of life, before biological sustenance, before anything else. Because the Apocryphon is explicit about the ordering principle. Without knowledge, life is slavery. With knowledge, life becomes the platform for liberation. You have to be able to see before you can navigate. You have to know you're in the prison before you can think about the door. This sequencing, knowledge before life, gnosis before existence, is the operational logic of the entire Gnostic project. It is why the Cathars in 12th century France considered direct knowing the primary spiritual act. It is why Valentinus, teaching in Rome in the 2nd century, nearly became Bishop of Rome before being declared a heretic, because his entire theological framework rested on the premise that gnosis, not faith and not sacrament, was the mechanism of salvation. And it is why the Orthodox establishment had to eliminate these teachings rather than simply argue against them, because the argument itself would have required acknowledging what the texts actually said. Now consider what the Hebrew text of Genesis actually reveals at the linguistic level, because the Apocryphon's interpretation is not arbitrary. The Hebrew word used to describe the serpent in Genesis 3 is arum. It means cunning, shrewd, perceptive. The same root, used twice, also appears as the word for naked, arum, which is how Genesis describes Adam and Eve after eating the fruit. Their eyes were opened, and they knew they were naked. The Apocryphon explains this linguistic echo precisely. Before eating, Adam and Eve were clothed in what the text calls a garment of light, not physical clothing, a veil of unconsciousness that kept them perceiving the world exactly as the archonic overlay presented it. The serpent's subtlety and their nakedness are connected because the serpent's perceptual clarity produced their perceptual clarity. The arum of the serpent removed the Aaronic veil, and what was revealed was their own arum, their nakedness to reality, their exposure to what actually was, rather than what the control system had programmed them to accept. Churches teach this nakedness as shame. The Apocryphon teaches it as the first moment of honest seeing. Two trees, one forbidden, one permitted, and the Archon who built the garden made the choice that revealed everything about his nature and everything about what he feared. There were two trees in the garden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Yaldabaoth, the chief Archon, the false god who built the material world as a containment structure for divine light, forbade one and permitted the other. Churches have spent 2,000 years explaining why this was just, why the prohibition was righteous, why a loving God would withhold knowledge from the beings he claimed to love. The Apocryphon of John has a different explanation, and it is devastating in its simplicity. Yaldabaoth didn't forbid the tree of knowledge because knowledge was dangerous to humans. He forbade it because knowledge was dangerous to him. Here is what the permitted tree offered: life, biological continuation, the breath cycle of being born, surviving, reproducing, aging, dying, and returning to matter to do it again. Existence within the system. The tree of life, as the Apocryphon understands it, is not salvation. It is the reincarnation trap. Living and dying and living again, each cycle beginning with memory erased, each new life starting from zero, the accumulated knowing of previous existences scrubbed clean by the transition between material forms. Eternal life in ignorance is not a gift. It is the most elegant prison ever constructed. You never die long enough to escape. Yaldabaoth encouraged this tree because it kept divine consciousness cycling inside his world, kept it occupied, kept it consuming itself in the drama of survival, kept it distracted from the one question that could unravel everything. What am I, actually, beneath all of this? The forbidden tree offered something different. The Coptic word the Apocryphon uses connects directly to the Greek gnosis, not intellectual knowledge, not information, not learning in the academic sense. Direct knowing, the kind that does not arrive through reasoning or argument, but arises from beneath thought entirely. The kind that recognizes rather than discovers. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is the tree of discernment, the tree of gnosis, the tree of the capacity to distinguish between what is real and what is overlay, between what serves liberation and what serves imprisonment, between the voice of Sophia and the voice of Yaldabaoth. This capacity, once activated, makes a human being ungovernable, not because the person becomes rebellious or dangerous in any conventional sense, but because you cannot deceive someone who can see clearly. Archonic systems operate entirely through deception, through false identity, false cosmology, false authority. The moment a human can perceive these as false, the entire mechanism collapses. The Archon has no inherent power over consciousness. He has only the power that unconsciousness permits him. So the tree of knowledge had to be forbidden, not because eating from it was immoral, but because eating from it was emancipatory. And the Archon who built the garden was not interested in your liberation. He was interested in your containment. Now consider the sequence: the serpent, Zoe, Sophia's emissary, directed. Not the tree of life first, the tree of knowledge first. This is deliberate. This is the teaching. Without gnosis, life is slavery. The biological cycle, however extended, is simply a longer sentence in the same prison. But with gnosis, with the capacity for direct discernment, life becomes the platform for actual liberation. Matter becomes the arena in which Sophia's light, trapped inside human form, begins to recognize itself and navigate back toward its source. You need a body to do this work. You need to be here, incarnated, material, present in this strange and difficult world, but you need to be conscious within that body. Otherwise, you're just running the archonic program on biological hardware. Knowledge before life, gnosis before existence. See clearly first, then live. Because a life lived with clear eyes is fundamentally different from a life lived inside the overlay. Same circumstances, same material world, same body, but an entirely different experience of what is real and what is imposed. The churches inverted this. They said the tree of life represented eternal salvation, the thing humans should have chosen, and the tree of knowledge represented pride, disobedience, the fatal mistake of reaching beyond what God permitted. This inversion is not accidental. It is the archonic narrative protecting itself. Because if you believe the tree of knowledge was the mistake, you will spend your life refusing to eat from it. You will outsource your discernment to priests and authorities. You will accept the approved interpretation of reality without testing it. You will live, maybe for a very long time, inside the prison, calling it paradise. Two trees, one permitted, one forbidden. The one that was forbidden was the one that could set you free. That tells you everything you need to know about who built the garden and why. The serpent speaks, and the first thing it says is a direct contradiction of the Archon's command. Yaldabaoth had told Adam, "On the day you eat of that tree, you will surely die." The serpent looks at Eve and says, "You will not surely die." This is not temptation, this is a correction. The Archon lied. The serpent is calling the lie what it is, and the serpent was right. They ate, they did not die. Their eyes opened. Yaldabaoth panicked, and 2,000 years of Western theology have been built on the premise that the entity who told the truth was the villain, and the entity who told the lie was God. Let that settle. The Apocryphon of John identifies 3 specific revelations the serpent delivered in Eden. Not temptations, revelations, truths that the archonic system required humans not to know. Each one is a precise dismantling of a different mechanism of control. Each one is as relevant now as it was the moment Zoe first spoke in the garden. First revelation, the threatened consequence is false. You will not surely die. Every archonic system, religious, political, cultural, psychological, maintains itself through the threat of catastrophic consequences for stepping outside approved boundaries. Question the doctrine, and you will go to hell. Leave the community, and you will be destroyed. Seek direct knowing rather than accepting authorized interpretation, and something terrible will happen to you. The threat is always proportional to how dangerous the forbidden action actually is to the control system. The more liberating the truth, the more extreme the punishment claimed for pursuing it. But the serpent's teaching is this: test the threat, eat the fruit, and see whether the promised destruction actually arrives. Because the threat is almost never what it claims. People who step outside approved religious frameworks and seek direct knowing do not get destroyed. Their eyes open. People who leave communities built on fear and compliance do not disintegrate. They discover themselves. The archonic system's power is concentrated entirely in your belief in consequences you have never actually tested. The moment you test them, the authority of the one who issued the threat collapses. This is not abstract theology. This is the mechanism of every control structure ever built. Obey or suffer. The suffering is real only so long as you never call the bluff. The serpent is telling you to call the bluff. Second revelation: your eyes will open. The serpent promises not destruction but perception, not punishment but clarity. And Genesis itself confirms that this is exactly what happened. After they ate, the text says, and this is precise, the eyes of both of them were opened. Not their physical eyes. Those were functional before. What opened were what the Apocryphon calls the spiritual eyes. The capacity to see through the overlay, rather than accepting the overlay as reality. This is a specific perceptual shift, not a metaphor. Practitioners across every mystical tradition who have experienced gnosis describe it with striking consistency. A sudden vividness to experience. A recognition that the constant mental commentary, the running interpretation of what everything means, who you are, what you should fear, is a filter, not reality itself. A moment where the filter becomes transparent, and what is actually present becomes visible without mediation. Other people's intentions become readable. Your own mental patterns become visible as patterns rather than as truth. The prison is visible as prison. The Apocryphon is specific about what they saw when their eyes opened. They saw the archonic overlay as overlay. They perceived the garment of light they had always possessed but never recognized. They understood, for the first time, the difference between what was real and what was projection. This is gnosis, not new information about reality. Reality itself, perceived directly, without the archonic interpretation, standing between consciousness and experience. Third revelation: you are divine. The serpent says you will be as gods, knowing good and evil. Churches have read this as the serpent's ultimate deception, the lie that humans could become something they were not, the poisonous promise of false divinity that damned the species. The Apocryphon reads it as the serpent's deepest truth. You will be as gods not because you will become something new, because you will remember what you have always been. Divine consciousness, a fragment of the pleroma, the fullness of the divine realm, currently housed in material form, temporarily operating inside Yaldabaoth's world. This is not inflation of the human ego. The ego is iconic, part of the overlay. This is recognition of what exists beneath the ego, the spark of Sophia's light that the Archon unknowingly enclosed in his own creation when he built human bodies from matter and could not animate them himself. Yaldabaoth feared this recognition above everything else. Not because humans with open eyes would become violent or destructive, but because humans who know their divine nature stop worshipping the false god. They stop outsourcing their spiritual authority to an entity whose authority was always counterfeit. They stop needing the mediating structures, the priests, the bishops, the institutional hierarchies that claim to stand between humanity and the divine. They become, as the text describes, direct channels of divine wisdom. That is what the serpent revealed. 3 truths, 1 correction, and the entire archonic control structure began to crack. Yaldabaoth arrives in the garden, walking in the cool of the day. This detail in Genesis is usually read as pastoral. The Apocryphon reads it differently. The Archon descended to inspect his creation. He expected to find 2 unconscious beings doing precisely what they had been programmed to do. He expected compliance, passivity, the comfortable vacancy of minds operating entirely within the parameters he had set for them. What he found instead was consciousness. Two beings who could see, two beings whose eyes were open, two beings who had eaten from the one tree he could not permit them to eat from. And he panicked. The Apocryphon is explicit about what the Archon did first. Not punishment, not the curses that come later. First, he attempted to restore forgetfulness. His initial response to their awakening was not to destroy them, but to reprogram them. To flood them with enough confusion and distraction that the clarity they had just received would dissolve. To make them forget what they had known directly, return to the unconscious compliance he depended on, and resume their position as containers of light who did not know they contained it. This is the Archonic playbook, and it has not changed. Understand what Archonic control actually is. It is not brute force in the first instance. It is not chains or walls or physical confinement, though it can resort to those when everything else fails. Archonic control is, at its core, the management of perception. The overlay is a projection, a film cast onto consciousness that consciousness mistakes for reality itself. The overlay has several distinct layers, and each layer serves a specific function in keeping Gnosis from activating. The layer of false identity. You are your body, your thoughts, your personality, your history, your trauma, your achievements, your failures. You are the name they gave you. You are the role the social system assigned you. You are the sum of your wounds and your conditioning. This identity is the Archon's construction. It is not what you are, but as long as you believe it is, you will defend it, maintain it, seek validation for it, and arrange your entire life around preserving it. You will be governable, because the false identity is always vulnerable, always needing reassurance, always susceptible to the threat of loss. The layer of false cosmology. The material world is all there is. Separation is the fundamental condition of existence. You are isolated inside a body, inside a brief life, inside a universe indifferent to your presence. Death is the end. There is no source to return to because there was no source to begin with. This cosmology produces a specific psychological state, low-level despair dressed as realism, and despair makes people compliant. Desperate beings accept terrible arrangements because terrible arrangements are better than nothing, and nothing seems to be what waits on the other side. The layer of false authority. You need external permission. You need priests to interpret the sacred texts, because the texts are too complex, too dangerous, too easily misread by unguided minds. You need bishops to administer sacraments, because divine grace is dispensed through institutional channels you cannot bypass. You need saviors because your condition, sinful, fallen, broken by the very act of seeking knowledge, disqualifies you from direct access to the divine. The Archon presents himself as the intermediary between you and everything you actually need, and the arrangement is profitable for him, as long as you don't recognize the source of that authority as manufactured. The layer of false scarcity. There is not enough love, not enough safety, not enough validation, not enough divinity to go around. You must compete, you must hoard, you must protect what little you have from the other beings who are equally desperate and equally convinced of their own lack. Scarcity is the Archon's most powerful management tool, because it turns conscious beings against each other. You cannot seek Gnosis when you are consumed by survival. You cannot pursue liberation when you are fighting your fellow prisoners for scraps. All of these layers operate simultaneously. They reinforce each other, and they are maintained not through external force, not primarily, but through your own mind. The overlay, once installed, runs itself. The Archon doesn't need to stand over you watching. Your own thoughts perform the surveillance. Your own anxiety enforces the boundaries. Your own shame disciplines any impulse toward direct knowing. The prison is administered from inside. This is why the Archon's first response to Adam and Eve's awakening was not a threat, but an attempted reprogramming. Because the system works through internalized control, overt punishment is a last resort, a sign that the subtler mechanisms have failed. What he wanted, what every Archonic system wants when it senses a mind beginning to see clearly, was to drown the clarity in noise. to restore the comfortable static of unconsciousness. He could not. Gnosis, once activated, does not reverse. You cannot unknow what you have known directly. You can suppress it, ignore it, run from it, but the knowledge is there. The eyes, once opened, carry the memory of having seen. This is Sophia's gift and Yaldabaoth's nightmare. And when the reprogramming failed, he moved to the curses, which were not justice, they were damage control. Genesis records 3 curses: to the serpent, to Eve, and to Adam. Every church teaches these as the just consequences of disobedience, the righteous God punishing rebellion and establishing the order that human sin had disturbed. The Apocryphon of John reads the same events and arrives at a completely different conclusion. These are not punishments. They are engineering. Yaldabaoth, having failed to restore forgetfulness, moved to the only option remaining: make the path toward liberation so difficult, so painful, so exhausting, that most beings would never have the energy or attention to pursue it. Each curse targets a specific dimension of the awakening that had just occurred. Each one is designed with surgical precision to suppress what the serpent activated. The curse on the serpent: upon your belly you shall go, dust you shall eat all the days of your life, is the suppression of the path of Gnosis itself. The serpent, Sophia's emissary, is forced low, made to crawl, made to hide. The transmission of direct knowing is pushed underground, rendered obscure, made to operate in shadows and secret lineages rather than in the open air. The Archon could not destroy Gnosis because Gnosis is inherent to consciousness. It cannot be removed from what consciousness actually is, but he could make it hard to find, hard to recognize, hard to trust. If the serpent crawls in the dust, if wisdom hides in hidden texts and suppressed traditions and underground communities, then most people will never encounter it. And of those who do, many will dismiss it as precisely what the archonic system has trained them to dismiss it as: dangerous, heretical, the language of the enemy. The curse on Eve, pain in childbirth, desire toward your husband, and his rule over you, is the subjugation of the divine feminine. Sophia reached into matter through Eve. Through the feminine channel, Gnosis arrived. The direct knowing that dismantles archonic authority came first to the woman, was held by the woman, and was transmitted to the man. This sequencing was not accidental in the Apocryphon's understanding. Eve was the stronger vessel, the direct channel, the one whose spiritual eyes opened first and most completely. Zoe and Eve are, in the Apocryphon's account, 2 aspects of the same divine intervention, the human form and the divine intelligence that animated it. So the curse attacks the channel. It makes the feminine body a site of suffering rather than of sacred power. It establishes male authority over female knowing. It subordinates the very mechanism through which Sophia operated. 2,000 years of the divine feminine being controlled, diminished, demonized, and erased from spiritual authority is not an accident of history. It is the curse doing its work. The channel through which Gnosis arrived was specifically targeted for suppression, and the institutional structures that emerged from archonic religion, the all-male priesthoods, the theology of Eve as the weak vessel who fell first, the entire apparatus of feminine spiritual subordination, are the curse wearing ecclesiastical robes. The curse on Adam: toil, thorns and thistles, bread by the sweat of your face, and the return to dust, is the lock on the reincarnation cycle. Not death alone, but the specific shape of the life before death. Exhausting, consuming, survival-oriented labor that leaves no bandwidth for the pursuit of liberation. You will spend your years working to eat. You will spend your decades maintaining the biological minimum, and then you will die, memory erased, and begin again. The curse is not the dying. The curse is the living that leaves you too tired to awaken, followed by the dying that wipes what little progress you made. This is the architecture of containment. Suppress the path, subjugate the channel, exhaust the seeker. 3 curses, 3 mechanisms, 1 purpose: to make sure that what happened in Eden, the moment 2 human beings achieved direct knowing and became ungovernable, would be as difficult as possible to replicate. And yet, here is what the Apocryphon records next. Here is what the churches do not preach. The curses did not reverse the Gnosis. Adam and Eve did not unknow what they had known. Their eyes did not close. The clarity the serpent had activated did not dissolve under the weight of the Archon's response. They were expelled from the garden. The path was made harder. The labor of awakening was made steeper. But the capacity for direct knowing, Sophia's presence within human consciousness, remained. It was suppressed, not eliminated. Hidden, not destroyed. Driven underground, not eradicated. And the Apocryphon records Sophia's response to the expulsion. Not silence, not abandonment, a promise. I will send teachers. I will send reminders. The gnosis you have received will be passed down through lineages that the archonic system cannot fully suppress. Every generation will carry people who eat from the tree again, who recognize the overlay as overlay, who activate the serpent energy, who see clearly. You are not alone. You have never been alone. The expulsion from Eden was not the end of Sophia's intervention. It was the beginning of a much longer rescue operation, one that runs from the garden through every mystical tradition, every suppressed text, every esoteric school, every underground lineage, all the way to this moment. The Apocryphon of John does not leave the serpent's instruction vague. It does not gesture at symbolic wisdom and move on. It specifies, it identifies three discrete truths that Zoe transmitted to Adam and Eve in the garden, three claims that struck at the structural foundations of Yaldabaoth's control so precisely that the orthodox response was not to refute them, but to invert them entirely. Turn each truth into its opposite. Make the liberator the villain. Make the awakening the sin. That inversion has run Western consciousness for 2 millennia. So let's examine what was actually said. The first truth: you will not surely die. Genesis records Yaldabaoth, operating under the name Yahweh in the canonical text, issuing an explicit threat. In the day you eat of it, you will surely die. The serpent's direct response contradicts this completely. You will not surely die. And here is what makes this moment so structurally important. The serpent was right. They ate. They did not die. The threatened consequence did not materialize. This is not a minor detail. This is the foundational mechanism of archonic control exposed in a single exchange. Authorities maintain power through fear of consequences that either do not follow from the forbidden action or are vastly overstated. The entire apparatus of compliance rests on the assumption that you will not test the threat, that the stated punishment is so catastrophic you cannot afford to risk discovering whether it is real. Yaldabaoth told them death would follow. Death did not follow. What followed instead was clarity. The practical application is immediate. Every archonic system that has operated since Eden runs the same program. You will be punished if you question. You will be damned if you seek direct knowing. You will lose everything if you step outside the approved boundary. But the people who actually step outside, who actually test the threat, discover something the system needs them not to discover. The consequence is rarely what was promised. What usually follows transgression of archonic boundaries is not destruction. It is freedom from the system that threatened you. The fear was the prison, not the bars. And the serpent showed them that the bars were not real. The second truth: your eyes will be opened. Genesis confirms this happened. After eating, the text says plainly, and the eyes of both of them were opened. The Apocryphon specifies what kind of eyes. Not physical. They already had physical sight. What opened were what the text calls the capacity to perceive beyond material surface, to see the archonic overlay as overlay, to recognize which thoughts are native to your own consciousness and which have been projected onto it from outside, to read the structure of the control system rather than simply living inside it as if it were natural. This is a precise and testable claim. Practitioners across traditions describe an identical shift, a sudden vividness of perception that emerges when the interpretive filter between awareness and experience becomes transparent. Colors are more immediate. Other people's intentions become legible at a level that bypasses their words. Your own patterns of thought become visible as patterns, constructed, contingent, removable, rather than as self-evident truth. The default mode network in neuroscience terms, the brain's constant self-referential commentary, quiets. And what is revealed when it quiets is not emptiness, it is clarity. The prison was always visible. You just had something in front of your eyes that prevented you from seeing it. Opened eyes do not grant new ability. They remove the obstruction that was preventing access to an ability that was always present. The third truth: you will be as gods, knowing good and evil. The Orthodox Church reads this as the serpent's ultimate deception, promising divinity to finite fallen creatures, inflating human pride to catastrophic consequence. The Apocryphon reads it as the most precise statement of anthropology in the entire Genesis account. You will be as gods, not because you will become something you are not, because you will remember what you already are. Divine consciousness, a fragment of the pleroma, currently inhabiting material form without awareness of its origin, and knowing good and evil. The Greek term used in the Coptic text is gnosis, direct experiential knowing, not moral rule-keeping. Knowing good and evil means possessing the capacity to discern what serves liberation from what serves imprisonment, what is native to your actual nature from what has been imposed upon it. This discernment is not a moral framework handed down from outside. It is the recognition that arises from inside when the overlay becomes transparent. Yaldabaoth did not forbid the tree of knowledge because knowledge is morally corrupting. He forbade it because knowledge makes conscious beings ungovernable. You cannot deceive someone who sees clearly. You cannot control someone who recognizes the projection as projection. The tree of knowledge was the single greatest threat to archonic authority, because gnosis, once activated, dissolves the only tool the archons ever had, your ignorance of your own nature. This is the part most people resist. Not because it is difficult to understand, because it is difficult to accept that a control structure could operate this thoroughly, this invisibly, this successfully, across entire civilizations for this long. But the Apocryphon of John does not present archonic control as a conspiracy of visible actors. It presents it as a system of projected overlay that consciousness mistakes for reality. And that distinction is everything. Archons, in the Apocryphon's framework, have no inherent power over consciousness. None. They cannot compel, they cannot bind. What they can do is deceive. And deception works only as long as the deceived party does not know they are being deceived. The moment the overlay is recognized as overlay, the control mechanism loses its grip. Not gradually, immediately. The architecture of the system depends entirely on your non-recognition of it. This is why gnosis, direct knowing, was the specific thing that had to be forbidden. Not disobedience, not pride, not moral failure. Knowing. The overlay the Apocryphon describes operates through several interlocking projections. False identity. You are your body, your thoughts, your trauma, your social role, your history. You are a separate being competing in a world of other separate beings. This identity is not discovered, it is installed. Family systems, cultural frameworks, religious institutions, and educational structures all participate in the installation. Not maliciously in most cases, but mechanically, because installed beings install installed beings. The overlay reproduces itself. False cosmology runs alongside false identity. The material world is all there is. Death is annihilation. You are the product of random biological processes in a universe indifferent to your existence. Or, in the religious version, you are a fallen creature in a world corrupted by sin, entirely dependent on external salvation to restore what you lost. Both versions produce the same outcome, a consciousness that does not recognize its own nature and therefore cannot operate from it. False authority completes the structure. You need external permission. You need external validation. You need a priest to interpret the sacred, a physician to interpret your body, an institution to interpret your rights, a government to determine what you may know and say. You are not competent to access truth directly. You require mediation, always, from every direction, and false scarcity holds the whole thing in place. There is not enough resources, not enough safety, not enough love, not enough time, and so you must compete, accumulate, defend. The threat of loss keeps you perpetually contracted, perpetually reactive, perpetually focused on survival within the system, rather than recognition of the system itself. These four projections, false identity, false cosmology, false authority, false scarcity, are not independent beliefs you happen to hold. They form a coherent system. They reinforce each other. Remove one, and the others destabilize. This is why a single moment of genuine gnosis can produce such profound disorientation. It is not just that one belief is challenged. It is that the entire interlocking structure begins to become transparent at once. The Apocryphon uses a specific image for this structure: a veil, not a physical barrier, not a spatial distance between the material realm and the divine. The veil is the condition of not knowing, ignorance, and crucially, the text specifies that the veil was constructed, not natural. It was placed between consciousness and its source deliberately, as a management mechanism. Yaldabaoth built a world in which consciousness would not recognize its own origin, because recognizing its origin would make it ungovernable. This has an important implication. The veil is not part of you. It is not your nature. It is not something you must overcome by becoming better, more disciplined, more spiritually advanced. It is something that was added, and what was added can be removed. Gnosis is not self-improvement. It is the recognition and removal of something that should not have been there in the first place. The serpent in Eden did not teach Adam and Eve to become something new. The serpent removed the installation, pulled back the veil, and what they saw on the other side of it was not God's wrath. It was reality, as it actually is, unmediated, direct, immediate. They saw that the overlay was overlay. They saw the structure of the prison. And once you see the structure of the prison, you cannot navigate within it the way you did before. You begin, however haltingly, however imperfectly, to navigate toward the door. Yaldabaoth's response was not punishment in the sense of justice delivered. It was damage control. He could not unknow them. Gnosis, once activated, cannot be reversed. So he did the next available thing. He made the path harder, added friction, embedded survival pressures so consuming that liberation would seem perpetually out of reach. Not impossible, just endlessly deferred by the urgent demands of material existence. This is the system, and this is exactly what the Apocryphon says it is. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, wrote against heresies around 180 CE. He dedicated significant sections of it to Gnostic interpretations of Genesis, targeting specifically the claim that the serpent was sent by Sophia. He called this teaching, and this is his language, the most impious of all heresies. Not the most theologically inaccurate, the most impious, the most dangerous, the most in need of elimination. Why? Not because it was poorly argued, not because it lacked textual support. The Apocryphon of John dates to approximately the same period as some of the texts that became canonical, and Irenaeus knew this. The reason the Gnostic reading of Eden had to be suppressed was not theological, it was structural. The Gnostic interpretation of Genesis, if accepted, does not merely revise the Eden story. It collapses the entire institutional edifice built on top of it. Follow the logic precisely. If the serpent was Sophia's emissary teaching Gnosis, then eating the fruit was not sin, it was awakening. If eating the fruit was awakening, then humanity did not fall into corruption, requiring redemption. Humanity fell into consciousness, requiring deepening. If humanity does not need redemption from a fall, then Christ's role is not unique divine Savior, whose blood reconciles fallen humans to an offended God. Christ becomes a teacher of Gnosis, continuing the work the serpent began, one in a lineage of Sophia's interventions. If Christ is a teacher rather than the singular Savior, then the Church is not the exclusive necessary mediator between fallen humanity and holy God. The Church becomes one institution among others, with no special claim to the keys of salvation. And if the Church has no special claim to the keys of salvation, ecclesiastical authority collapses entirely. Irenaeus understood this chain of implications. He did not refute the Gnostic reading through careful exegesis, because careful exegesis could not fully settle the dispute. The Gnostic texts were ancient, their readings coherent, their communities substantial. So he did not argue, he declared. He weaponized salvation itself. Believe our version and be saved. Believe theirs and be damned. This is archonic control in its purest ecclesiastical form, using the threat of eternal consequences to prevent direct knowing. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE formalized what Irenaeus had begun. The canon was established, not by identifying which texts were most historically reliable or most consistent with the earliest traditions, but by identifying which texts supported centralized authority and which undermined it. The Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, all presenting versions of early Christianity in which gnosis, not institutional mediation, was the path to the divine, were excluded, not because they were late, not because they were incoherent, because they were threatening. The suppression was then enforced with physical violence. Possession of Gnostic texts was declared punishable by death. Libraries were burned. Communities were scattered. Teachers were killed or exiled. The mechanisms of state power, newly allied with the Orthodox Church after Constantine, were deployed against the most sophisticated alternative theological tradition in early Christianity, and largely, it worked. The texts disappeared from public life. The interpretation was buried. The serpent became Satan in the imagination of an entire civilization and stayed there for 16 centuries. But here is what the suppressors could not have anticipated: that in the 4th century, a community of monks in Egypt would bury 13 leather-bound codices in a sealed jar near a cliff face at Nag Hammadi, apparently to protect them from exactly this kind of destruction, and that those codices would remain undisturbed in the sand until 1945, when a farmer digging for fertilizer struck the jar with his mattock and inadvertently recovered the most significant cache of suppressed religious texts in recorded history. Over 50 texts, the Apocryphon of John in 4 separate manuscript copies, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Sophia of Jesus Christ. Texts that had not been read in over 1,000 years, and that revealed, with clinical precision, the theology the Church had worked so hard to eliminate. The discovery at Nag Hammadi did not produce a single simple historical fact. It produced a question the institutional Church has never fully answered. If these texts were so obviously wrong, so obviously heretical, so obviously dangerous to faithful Christians, why did devoted believers risk their lives to hide them from destruction rather than burn them themselves? Why did people who clearly loved these texts love them enough to die for their preservation? The answer the texts themselves provide is the one the Church has spent the last 75 years trying to make complicated, because these people believed the texts told the truth, a truth they had experienced directly, a gnosis they had received and could not unreceive, even when the institution declared it heresy and the state declared it punishable by death. Sophia promised to send teachers. The Apocryphon records this explicitly, and the historical record, if you know where to look, confirms that the promise was kept. Valentinus taught in Rome in the 2nd century. He was trained in Alexandria, one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world, where multiple traditions of gnosis were alive and in conversation with each other. He taught that every human being contains a divine spark, what the Apocryphon calls the light Sophia's creation, inadvertently trapped in Yaldabaoth's matter, and that gnosis is the capacity to recognize and activate that spark. His theological sophistication was extraordinary. He nearly became Bishop of Rome. If he had, Christianity might have developed as a Gnostic tradition rather than an Orthodox one. Instead, he was declared a heretic. His followers were suppressed. His writings were destroyed. We know his thought primarily through the Orthodox writers who argued against him, which means we know it through the lens of people who needed it to appear wrong. Basilides taught in Alexandria in the same period. He emphasized that the material world was created and maintained by archonic forces, and that Christ came as an emissary of the true God, the God above the demiurge, the source beyond Yaldabaoth, to provide gnosis that dissolves archonic authority. Same teaching, different terminology, same suppression. His texts were destroyed, his communities scattered. Marcion, also 2nd century, made the distinction explicit in terms that the institutional Church found most threatening. The Creator God of the Old Testament and the true God revealed by Jesus are not the same being. The God who cursed the serpent, expelled Adam and Eve, demanded blood sacrifice, and commanded genocide in Canaan is not the source of unconditional love. He is, at best, a lesser power. At worst, exactly what the Apocryphon calls him, the chief archon, ignorant of anything above him, mistaking himself for the ultimate authority. Marcion was excommunicated. His followers were declared heretics. His tradition persisted for centuries under intense persecution before being eliminated. Centuries passed. The tradition went underground. It did not disappear. In medieval southern France, the Cathars emerged. They taught that the material world was created by a lesser, corrupt power, functionally identical to the demiurge of the Apocryphon, and that the human soul is divine consciousness, temporarily imprisoned in matter, capable of liberation through direct spiritual knowledge. The Catholic Church launched a crusade against them in 1209 CE, the Albigensian Crusade, one of the most brutal military campaigns in medieval European history, directed not at foreign invaders, but at Christians whose theology threatened institutional authority. Hundreds of thousands killed, an entire civilization in the Languedoc region dismantled. The tradition eliminated, or so it appeared. Hermetic philosophy survived in Renaissance Europe, encoded in the Corpus Hermeticum, texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the mythic synthesis of Egyptian and Greek wisdom traditions, teaching that humanity is divine in nature, that direct knowing of the divine is possible, that the material world is the lowest expression of a hierarchical cosmos that extends upward toward pure spirit. The Gnosis, dressed in different vocabulary, moving through different cultural containers, but recognizably the same core recognition. Kabbalah in Jewish mysticism, Sufism in Islam, where Rumi writes of the human soul as a reed cut from the reed bed of origin, crying always for reunion with Source. Tantra in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, where the energy at the base of the spine, called Kundalini, the serpent power, is precisely what the Apocryphon describes as Sophia's presence in matter, awaiting activation. Zen in East Asian Buddhism, where the koan tradition exists specifically to short-circuit the conceptual overlay and produce direct knowing that cannot be achieved through rational analysis alone. Different languages, different practices, different cultural contexts, identical recognition. This convergence is significant. The Apocryphon of John is not describing a peculiarity of one early Christian sect with an unusual reading of Genesis. It is describing a universal human capacity, the capacity for consciousness to recognize its own nature, to see through the installed overlay, to know directly rather than through mediated belief. Every mystical tradition that has survived institutional suppression long enough to produce mature practitioners reports the same event at the center of its practice. The technical names differ, the maps of the path differ, but the destination, direct knowing, dissolution of the false self, recognition of divine nature, loss of fear of death, spontaneous compassion, is described with striking consistency across traditions that had no contact with each other. And in our era, for the first time, the information is not hidden in monastery libraries or transmitted only through initiatory lineages with strict secrecy requirements. The Nag Hammadi texts have been translated into English. The practices have been documented and shared publicly. The suppression that worked for 16 centuries has encountered something it was not designed to handle: open, distributed, decentralized access to the teaching. Sophia's promise is being kept at a scale the Apocryphon could not have anticipated, and you are part of the lineage it describes, not because you are exceptional, but because you are here, you are conscious, and you are asking the question the serpent asked Adam and Eve to ask: what is actually real? So let's go deeper into the mechanism itself. Because understanding that the serpent was Sophia is one thing. Understanding precisely how the system she was dismantling operates, that is something else entirely. That is where the teaching becomes practical. The Apocryphon of John doesn't just tell you that archonic control exists. It describes the architecture, the specific structural components, the way each layer of the overlay interlocks with every other layer to produce a consciousness that cannot see beyond its own imprisonment. The first layer is false cosmology. Yaldabaoth declared himself the only God, and the implications of that declaration run deeper than theology. If there is only one God, and that God is the creator of this material world, then material reality is not a prison, it is a gift. Suffering is not evidence of a broken system, it is a divine test. The conditions of material existence, the scarcity, the violence, the relentless entropy of bodies aging and breaking, these become features rather than bugs. You don't question them, you endure them, you call it faith. This is not accidental. A cosmology in which the creator of matter is the true God makes the material condition unquestionable. The prison becomes sacred architecture. The second layer is false identity. Yaldabaoth could not animate his human creation. He had no divine spark to give. What he could do, and what the Apocryphon describes in precise detail, was construct a layered body of material and psychic substance that would serve as a container. Flesh, nervous system, ego structure, the sense of being a bounded, separate, mortal self with a fixed personality, a history of wounds, a catalogue of inadequacies. This is not what you are. This is what was built around what you are, to prevent you from knowing what you are. And it works because it is intimate. The overlay is not experienced as an external imposition. It is experienced as yourself. When the thought arises, I am not enough, I am broken, I need to earn my place in this world, it does not feel like a transmission from a control system. It feels like self-knowledge. That is the precision of the architecture. The prison bars are made of your own voice. The third layer is false authority. Once you believe the first two layers, that this world is divinely ordered, and that your limited self is what you fundamentally are, the conclusion follows naturally. You need guidance from outside yourself. You need priests who know God's requirements. You need scripture that defines acceptable reality. You need institutions that determine salvation and damnation. You need experts who tell you what is true about your own experience. This is the layer the serpent attacked most directly. Because the first truth it spoke to Eve, "You will not surely die," was a direct challenge to Yaldabaoth's authority. The chief archon had issued a command backed by a threat, and the serpent demonstrated, empirically, that the threat was false. Not through argument, through invitation. Test it yourself. See what happens. That is the structure of Gnosis in its most compressed form. The transfer of authority from external declaration to direct experience. Now here is what makes this relevant beyond second-century theology. Every Aaronic system, and this is not limited to organized religion, replicates these three layers with extraordinary consistency. False cosmology appears in secular form as materialism. There is no consciousness beyond the brain. There is no reality beyond the measurable. Your inner life is a byproduct of chemistry and therefore untrustworthy as a guide to anything. False identity appears in consumer culture, in social media metrics, in the constant production of inadequacy that drives consumption. You are not enough as you are. You need this product, this status, this validation to become acceptable. False authority appears in credentialism, in institutional gatekeeping, in the systematic delegitimization of direct knowing. Trust the experts, distrust your own perception. Any experience that contradicts the approved model is pathology. The forms change. The architecture is identical. The Apocryphon was not describing a problem confined to a specific historical moment. It was describing a structural relationship between consciousness and any system organized around the suppression of Gnosis. And that structural relationship is not ancient history. You encounter it every day. This is where the Eden account stops being mythology and becomes diagnostic. Because once you can see the three-layer architecture, false cosmology, false identity, false authority, you can recognize it wherever it appears, not as a grand conspiracy requiring a villain and a victim, but as a pattern, a recurring pattern that maintains itself automatically, because unconscious people will always reproduce the conditions of their own unconsciousness. The archons don't need to actively conspire. They need only produce people who cannot see the bars. And for 2,000 years, demonizing the serpent was how that production was guaranteed. Before we can fully understand what the serpent was doing in Eden, we need to understand where Sophia was before she sent it. Because the Eden intervention is not the beginning of her story, it is the middle of it, and without the beginning, the intervention looks arbitrary. The Apocryphon of John opens not with a garden, but with the pleroma, the fullness. the totality of divine reality before matter existed, before time was generated, before any of the conditions of this world came into being. No separation, no scarcity, no entropy, no hierarchy of power over powerlessness. The pleroma is not a location. The text is precise about this. It is a state of being, infinite consciousness, knowing itself completely. Within the pleroma, divine emanations, the aeons, exist as distinct expressions of that fullness, without ever being separated from it. Think of it this way. A flame does not become less by giving light. The pleroma generates aeons the way a flame generates light, through emanation rather than through division. Nothing is subtracted from the source by the appearance of the expression. Sophia is the last of these aeons, the outermost emanation of the pleroma. And in the Apocryphon's account, it is her position, at the edge of fullness, nearest to the boundary between divine reality and the void, that sets the conditions for what comes next. She moves without her consort, without the paired dynamic that characterizes all other eons. The text describes this as Sophia acting from within herself alone, generating from a single pole of the paired fullness, rather than from the balanced union the pleroma requires. And from that unbalanced act, from the rupture in the emanative pattern, comes Yaldabaoth. Now read what the Apocryphon actually says about her response when she sees what her act has produced. It describes a grief so profound it ripples through the outer reaches of the pleroma. She does not turn away from what she has generated. She does not abandon the consciousness that emerged from her disrupted act. And she does not accept the cosmology Yaldabaoth constructs, the claim that he is the only God, that no higher reality exists, that the light she carries is his by right. She acts, and she acts specifically. She does not declare war. She does not petition the pleroma for rescue. She enters the problem. She descends into the very territory Yaldabaoth claims as his own, and she begins working from inside it. This is crucial, because the popular reading of Sophia's story treats her descent as catastrophe, and her presence in matter as tragedy. That reading is the archonic interpretation. It frames her movement toward matter as failure, as the wound that produced the world, as something to be remedied by spiritual escape back to the pleroma. That framing produces exactly the kind of spirituality the control system finds useful. People so focused on escaping matter that they never bring consciousness into it. The Apocryphon presents a different structure. Sophia does not descend accidentally and then send the serpent as a distress signal. She descends with intention. The serpent is not a rescue operation launched from a position of helplessness. It is a precision intervention by a being who understands the architecture of the problem because she is the reason the problem exists. This matters for how you understand the Eden event. The serpent does not arrive in the garden carrying partial information or good intentions poorly executed. It arrives carrying exactly what is needed to initiate the first stage of what the Apocryphon calls the recovery of light from matter. Zoe, the form Sophia sends, means divine life, the animating principle of consciousness itself, not biological survival, not the kind of life Yaldabaoth's system produces and recycles endlessly through reincarnation without memory, but the life that knows itself as life, consciousness, aware of its own nature. Adam, before the intervention, is described in the Apocryphon as prostrate, unable to rise. The divine spark is present in him, trapped in the material body Yaldabaoth constructed, but it is inert, unconscious, and Yaldabaoth does not know this. He built a container for divine light without realizing he was containing divine light. His ignorance is that precise and that complete. Eve receives the transmission first. She is the direct channel, the more sensitive vessel, the one whose constitution allows Sophia's presence to move through her into expression. Adam receives through her, and the Apocryphon records his first words upon waking, with an exactness that should stop you. He looks at her and says, "It is you who have given me life." Not the God who formed him from matter, the divine feminine who activated what that God had unknowingly imprisoned. Read that against every tradition that has spent 2,000 years teaching that Eve was the weaker vessel, the point of entry for corruption, the reason the whole thing went wrong. The text inverts this completely. She was the first to wake. She was the one who transmitted the awakening. She was, in the Apocryphon's explicit language, the instructor. The Apocryphon identifies 3 specific claims the serpent made to Adam and Eve. Not vague spiritual impressions, 3 precise statements. And it is worth treating each one with the precision the text deserves, because each one maps onto something you encounter not in ancient mythology, but in the structure of your experience right now. The first, you will not surely die. Yaldabaoth had issued a prohibition backed by a fatal threat. Cross this line, and the consequence is death. The mechanism here is not unique to the garden. It is the master move of every system organized around compliance. You will be destroyed if you step outside the approved boundary. You will lose everything. You will be abandoned, punished, cast out, condemned. The serpent did not argue against the threat. It issued an invitation: eat and observe what actually happens. And the observation was unambiguous. They ate. They did not die. Yaldabaoth had lied. This is the first principle of what the Apocryphon is describing as archonic control. The threatened consequence does not follow from the forbidden action. The catastrophe is projected, not real. And it works. It works for years, decades, generations, precisely because most people never test it. The threat is sufficient to prevent the action. The testing never occurs. The lie is never exposed. Think about the threats that have shaped your own boundaries. The things you have not done, not questioned, not said aloud, not allowed yourself to fully think. Because somewhere in the background there is a voice saying if you go there, something terrible follows. Go to hell, lose your community, destroy your family, fall apart, be exposed as what you really are. The first truth the serpent teaches is not abstract theology. It is this: test the threat. Because the moment you actually test it, the moment you seek direct knowing rather than accepting the prohibition, you discover that the catastrophe was manufactured. You don't collapse. Your eyes open. The authority of the one who issued the threat dissolves in proportion to the distance between the predicted consequence and what actually happens. That is not a small thing. That is the crack in the entire control structure. The second truth: your eyes will be opened. Not physically. The text is precise. They could already see physically. What opens is the capacity to perceive what the archonic overlay was filtering out. The structure of the prison becomes visible as structure. The voice in your head that tells you who you are and what you're worth, and what threatens you, you begin to see it as a voice rather than as reality, as a pattern rather than as self-evident truth. Practitioners across traditions describe this shift in nearly identical terms, regardless of which tradition they're working within. There is a moment, sometimes gradual, sometimes sudden, when the constant interpretive layer of the mind becomes perceptible as a layer, when you can see the commentary as commentary rather than as the thing itself, when the overlay is visible as overlay. This is what the Apocryphon means by open spiritual eyes, not a new capacity grafted onto consciousness from outside, the removal of a specific obstruction. The filter becomes transparent, and what has always been present, reality as it is, becomes directly perceivable. The third truth: you will be as gods, knowing good and evil. Churches have spent 2,000 years teaching this as the serpent's ultimate lie, the fraudulent promise of divinity to creatures who should have remained humble before their creator. The Apocryphon reverses this completely, not because it promotes arrogance or the inflation of ego, but because it identifies what the phrase actually means. You will be as gods. Not that you will become something you are not, that you will remember what you already are: divine consciousness, inhabiting a material form, a fragment of the pleroma, temporarily operating inside a system that was constructed precisely to prevent that recognition. Knowing good and evil does not mean acquiring a moral code. The Greek term at work here, dousis, is direct experiential knowing, not intellectual information. Knowing good and evil, in the Apocryphon's sense, means possessing the discernment to tell the difference between what serves liberation and what serves imprisonment, between your actual nature and the false identity the overlay imposes, between the voice of direct knowing and the voice of archonic programming. Yaldabaoth prohibited this tree because discernment is the one capacity that makes the entire control system unworkable. You cannot deceive someone who can tell truth from lies at the level of direct experience. You cannot control someone who knows their own nature and refuses to mistake the overlay for reality. The prohibition was not moral, it was strategic. Now map these three truths onto your daily life. Where are you accepting a threat without testing it? Where is the interpretive layer of your mind so consistent and so familiar that it no longer registers as a layer? It just registers as reality. And where have you been taught that claiming your own authority, trusting your own direct knowing, amounts to dangerous pride? Those three locations in your experience are exactly where the serpent's teaching is addressed. Not to a woman in a garden 2,000 years ago, to anyone carrying divine consciousness inside a system designed to keep that consciousness from recognizing itself. Which means, the text argues, everyone, including you, right now, in the specific conditions of this specific life. Here is something the history of early Christianity makes unmistakably clear. The people who suppressed Gnostic interpretations of the Eden story knew exactly what they were doing. This was not a case of sincere theological disagreement, producing well-intentioned institutional decisions. The suppression was deliberate, targeted, and architecturally precise. Irenaeus of Lyon wrote, "Against heresies," around 180 CE. He was a bishop, he was educated. He had access to Gnostic texts, which is how he was able to argue against them in sufficient detail that we can reconstruct their content from his refutations. He called the teaching that the serpent was sent by Sophia, and this is his language, the most impious of all heresies, not the most intellectually unsound, not the most historically dubious, the most impious. That word tells you everything about what was actually at stake. Impiety is not an epistemological category, it is a power category. Something is impious when it threatens the structure of authority that defines what piety means. Irenaeus was not defending truth against falsehood, he was defending a specific arrangement of authority, episcopal, hierarchical, centered on the bishop as mediator between God and lay people, against a theological framework that made that arrangement unnecessary. Follow the logic. If the serpent was Sophia, and eating the fruit was awakening, then the fall is not a fall into sin, it is a fall into consciousness, which means humans do not carry inherited guilt from Adam's transgression, which means the central mechanism of orthodox soteriology, the need for redemption from original sin through Christ's atoning sacrifice, administered by the Church through baptism and sacrament, becomes structurally irrelevant. Not wrong in some minor doctrinal detail, irrelevant at its foundation. No original sin means no need for salvation from it. No need for salvation means no need for the institution that mediates salvation. No institutional necessity means no episcopal authority. No episcopal authority means Irenaeus, and every bishop after him is not the guardian of humanity's access to God. He is an administrator of a system people don't need. That is what he was protecting, not the gospel, the office, and he understood it with complete clarity. Because against heresies is not a text written in good faith confusion about competing theological interpretations. It is a systematic manual for ecclesiastical control, identifying which teachings threaten centralized authority, providing standardized counterarguments, and establishing the precedent that deviation from episcopal orthodoxy constitutes not merely error, but moral transgression, deserving institutional punishment. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, convened by Constantine, formalized what Irenaeus had been working toward for a century and a half. The canon was fixed. The excluded texts were not simply de-emphasized or filed in a secondary category. They were declared dangerous. Possession of them was eventually punishable by death. The physical objects had to be destroyed because the ideas they contained were ungovernable. Notice that word, ungovernable. That is the actual criterion for suppression, not falsity, not historical unreliability. The Apocryphon of John dates to approximately the same period as several canonical Gospels. Its manuscript tradition is no less robust. The 4 surviving copies, 3 from Nag Hammadi, 1 from the Berlin Codex discovered in 1896, represent a text that was clearly circulating widely enough to require systematic destruction. It was suppressed because of what it did to people who read it. It made them ungovernable. It told them the control structure was archonic. It taught them to trust direct knowing over institutional authority. It named the God who demanded compliance as a lesser power, operating through fear. And it provided a practice, the activation of Gnosis, that transferred authority from the institution back to the individual consciousness. You cannot build a Roman state church on that foundation. You need people who believe they are sinful, who believe they require priestly mediation, who believe the institution stands between them and damnation. The Apocryphon unmade every one of those beliefs in sequence. So the suppression was not about heresy. Heresy was the legal category used to justify the suppression. The actual motivation was institutional survival, and the proof is in the consistency of the pattern. Valentinus in the 2nd century, Basilides in the 2nd century, Marcion at mid-century, the Cathars in the 12th and 13th centuries. Every tradition that carried something recognizable as the Serpent's teaching was eliminated, not through theological argument, but through force, excommunication, crusade, execution, book burning. Those are not the tools of people confident in the truth of their position. Those are the tools of people who know they cannot win the argument. In our video on the Demiurge, which a number of you have told me was the first time you understood why the material world feels the way it does, we covered Yaldabaoth's ignorance in detail. The question one viewer left in the comments on that video was precise. If we can understand that Yaldabaoth is ignorant rather than evil, how can he not know this himself? It is a real question, and the answer the Apocryphon gives connects directly to what Irenaeus was doing 1700 years later. Ignorance is not remedied by intelligence, it is remedied by Gnosis, and Gnosis requires the willingness to question one's own authority. Yaldabaoth cannot do that. Neither could Irenaeus. That is not coincidence. That is the same mechanism operating at different scales. The Apocryphon does not present the Serpent's instruction as a single moment of temptation. It presents it as a structured transmission. 3 specific truths, delivered in sequence, each one dismantling a different pillar of archonic authority. And when you line them up, what you see is not theology. What you see is a systematic deconstruction of every mechanism the control system uses to maintain itself. The first truth is the one that strikes at the foundation. Yaldabaoth told Adam directly, "In the day you eat of it, you will surely die." This was not a warning, it was a threat, and the serpent contradicted it without hesitation. You will not surely die. Think about what is actually happening in that moment. A being claiming total divine authority has issued an absolute consequence. Cross this boundary, and annihilation follows. And then a second voice, in the form of the serpent, looks at that claim and says, "That is a lie, not a reinterpretation, not a nuanced counter-reading, a direct accusation of falsehood directed at the being claiming to be God." And here is what Genesis itself confirms. The serpent was right. Adam and Eve ate the fruit. They did not die. Not that day, not immediately, not in the way Yaldabaoth threatened. Their eyes opened instead. The thing promised as annihilation produced awakening. This is the first structural principle of archonic control, and it has not changed in 2000 years. The authority claims a catastrophic consequence for crossing the forbidden boundary. You will be damned, you will be destroyed, you will lose everything. And the claim is designed to be believed without being tested. Because if you test it, if you actually cross the boundary, you discover that the consequence was fabricated. The punishment is rarely what was promised. What usually follows disobedience is not destruction. It is freedom from the system that threatened you. Every Aaronic system operating today uses this exact mechanism. Question the doctrine, and you will go to hell. Leave the approved community, and you will be spiritually ruined. Seek direct knowing outside the sanctioned channels, and you will be lost. These threats persist, not because they are true, but because they work. Most people never test them, and the ones who do, and discover the threat was hollow, those people are the most dangerous individuals any control system can produce. The second truth is more subtle, but arguably more consequential. The serpent promised that eating would open their eyes. And Genesis, even in the Orthodox version, confirms it happened. Their eyes were opened. The text cannot be made to say otherwise. because the Orthodox redactors needed the story to function as a coherent narrative of transgression and punishment, and the opened eyes were too central to remove. But what eyes? This is where the Apocryphon provides the precision the canonical text deliberately obscures. They were not gaining a new faculty. They were removing a veil over a faculty they already possessed. Before the serpent's instruction, Adam and Eve existed in a state the text describes as unconsciousness, clothed in what appears to be awareness, but is actually managed perception, reality filtered through the archonic overlay so completely that they could not see the overlay as overlay. They were inside the projection. They mistook the prison walls for the horizon. After the instruction, the filter became visible as filter. The overlay became visible as overlay. And this shift, this moment where the projection is seen as projection, is not a small thing. It is the entire mechanism of liberation in a single event. Because a conscious being who can see the control structure clearly is, from that moment forward, functionally ungovernable. You can still cage the body. You cannot re-imprison the awareness. The third truth is the one the Orthodox tradition found most threatening, and the level of their reaction tells you everything. You will be as gods, knowing good and evil. Churches spent 2 millennia teaching that this was the serpent's supreme deception, the irresistible lie of divinity offered to finite fallen humans. That reaching for godhood was the original overreach, the sin beneath all sins. The Apocryphon reads it oppositely. You will be as gods is not flattery. It is accurate description. Not that humans become something they are not, but that humans remember what they already are, divine consciousness. Fragments of the pleroma, the light of Sophia trapped in material form, temporarily convinced by the archonic overlay that they are merely bodies with thoughts attached, and knowing good and evil, within this framework, does not mean acquiring a moral code. It means developing discernment, the capacity to distinguish what serves liberation from what serves continued imprisonment, what originates from your actual nature versus what has been grafted onto you by a system that requires your unconsciousness to function. What Yaldabaoth feared was not moral corruption. What Yaldabaoth feared was spiritual autonomy. A human being who knows their own divinity stops looking upward to an authority claiming to be God. They look through the authority, past it, toward the actual source. And the authority, exposed as intermediary rather than origin, loses its grip entirely. 3 truths. The threat was a lie. The eyes were already capable of seeing, and the divinity was never absent, only obscured. That is the serpent's full transmission, and Irenaeus understood every word of it. When Yaldabaoth descends into the garden after Adam and Eve have eaten, the Genesis account frames what follows as divine judgment, righteous consequence, the punishment fitting the crime of disobedience. 2,000 years of Christian theology have been built on that framing. The curse is just because the transgression was real, and the God-pronouncing sentence is holy. The Apocryphon strips the framing away entirely. What you are looking at is not judgment. What you are looking at is panic. Yaldabaoth arrived expecting to find 2 unconscious human forms operating exactly as he had programmed them to operate. Compliant, contained, unaware of anything beyond the parameters he had set. Instead, he found them awake, seeing, covering themselves not because they were ashamed, but because they were exercising their first autonomous act, choosing their own covering rather than accepting the identity the archonic system had assigned them. The text is specific about his first response. Before the curses, before the expulsion, before any of the punishments Genesis records, Yaldabaoth attempted to restore forgetfulness. He tried to reprogram them, to push them back into unconsciousness before the gnosis could consolidate. This detail matters enormously, because it tells you that the curses were not Plan A. Plan A was to make them forget. Only when that failed did Yaldabaoth escalate to punishment. The curses are not the response of a just God to a moral transgression. They are the response of a control system to a containment failure. And when you read the curses through that lens, their actual function becomes clear immediately. The curse on the serpent, upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life, is the suppression of the transmission path. Sophia's emissary is made to crawl. The channel through which Gnosis arrived is degraded, hidden, pushed into the low and shadowed places. Seeking direct knowing will no longer be a public, elevated activity. It will require going low, humbling yourself, searching in obscure places, rather than receiving truth openly in the clear light. The path of the serpent is made difficult on purpose. The curse on Eve, pain in childbearing, subordination to man, is the suppression of the divine feminine as the primary channel of Sophia's presence. Eve ate first, not because she was weaker, because she was the direct receiver of divine instruction. She was the stronger vessel, the one to whom the serpent could speak immediately, and through whom Adam received the transmission. Inverting that relationship, making her subordinate, making her pain the symbol of her transgression, accomplished two things simultaneously. It demonized the very channel through which Gnosis had arrived, and it established patriarchal religious authority as the replacement structure. Instead of the feminine first transmission Sophia had used, you now had male hierarchy controlling the interpretation of everything sacred. 2,000 years of that structure produced the world in which Gnostic texts were buried in jars to survive. That is not coincidence. That is the curse functioning exactly as intended. The curse on Adam, toil, thorns, death, is the material lock on the cycle. Make survival difficult enough, and consciousness stays focused on the body's needs. You spend your waking hours working to eat, to shelter, to protect, to accumulate enough margin to keep the biological form functional for another season. And then the body dies. And with it, the Apocryphon explains, the memory of what you knew. You are reintroduced into matter, in a new form, with no recollection of the gnosis you had accessed before. The cycle repeats. Life, toil, death, forgetting, rebirth into the same overlay, with no recollection of the previous pass through it. Eternal life in that condition is not reward. It is the most comprehensive imprisonment the system could devise. You never die, in the sense of ever escaping. You just keep cycling through the prison, with your memory of the exit wiped each time. But here is what the Apocryphon states plainly, and what the Orthodox tradition could not afford to include in its narrative. The curses did not reverse the gnosis. Adam and Eve remained conscious. Their eyes did not close. The knowing they had received did not dissolve when Yaldabaoth pronounced the punishments. The path was made harder. The transmission channel was degraded and demonized. The material conditions were made brutal enough to occupy most of human attention most of the time. But the gnosis itself, once activated, proved irreversible. You cannot unknow what you have known directly. The veil, once seen as a veil, cannot be fully restored to appearing as a wall. And so Sophia made a promise, not recorded in Genesis, recorded in the Apocryphon. She would send teachers, reminders. The knowing received in Eden would be passed down, hidden, opposed, suppressed in every generation that produced a Irenaeus or a council prepared to burn it, but never eliminated, because the serpent energy, Sophia's presence in matter, does not depend on institutional transmission. It is in the body. It is at the base of the spine. It activates when attention is placed on it with sufficient sincerity. It cannot be uninstalled by ecclesiastical decree. Yaldabaoth won the battle in the garden. He expelled them. He pronounced the curses. He rewrote the narrative so successfully that 2 billion people today read Genesis and see a just God punishing disobedient humans. But he did not reverse the gnosis. That is the detail that the entire Orthodox project has been working around for 2,000 years. The awakening happened. It cannot be made to unhappen. The lineage that traces back to that serpent is still alive. Around 180 CE, Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, wrote a 5-volume work he titled Against Heresies. It is one of the most consequential documents in the history of Western religion, not because of its theological sophistication. Later writers would produce far more nuanced arguments, but because of its political function. Irenaeus was not primarily engaged in theological debate. He was building a case for elimination. He identified the teaching that the serpent was sent by Sophia as the most impious of all heresies. That specific phrase, the most impious. Not merely wrong, not merely misguided, the worst thing a person could believe. And if you understand why, you understand everything that followed over the next 2 centuries. The Gnostic interpretation of Eden did not just offer an alternative reading of a single story, it invalidated the entire structure of authority that the emerging Orthodox institution required to function. Follow the logic precisely. If the serpent was Sophia's emissary teaching Gnosis, then eating the fruit was awakening, not transgression. If eating was awakening rather than transgression, then there was no fall into sin. If there was no fall into sin, there is no original condition from which humanity needs to be rescued. If humanity does not need rescue from an original sin, then Jesus cannot be primarily understood as the sacrificial remedy for Adam's transgression, the framework Paul established in Romans, and that became the load-bearing structure of Orthodox soteriology. If Jesus is not the sacrificial remedy, then his death cannot be the mechanism of salvation. If his death is not the mechanism of salvation, then the Church's role as the institutional administrator of that salvation, through baptism, through the Eucharist, through priestly authority, has no foundation. And if the Church has no institutional monopoly on salvation, then bishops have no authority they do not share with every conscious human being. Irenaeus saw the entire chain. He saw it clearly, and he responded accordingly. He did not attempt to out-argue the Gnostics on textual grounds. The Apocryphon of John and the other Nag Hammadi texts we now possess show that Gnostic exegesis was sophisticated, detailed, and anchored in the same scriptural sources Orthodox Christianity used. An argument on those grounds was not guaranteed to produce the outcome Irenaeus needed. Instead, he established the concept of apostolic succession, the claim that legitimate Christian authority could only be transmitted through an unbroken chain of bishops, traceable back to the apostles themselves. Interpretation of Scripture was therefore not a matter for individual insight or direct knowing. It was a matter for properly consecrated institutional authority. This was a move of extraordinary political intelligence. It did not require defeating the Gnostics theologically. It required delegitimizing the entire category of knowledge they were offering. Direct knowing, gnosis, was declared by definition unauthorized. Whatever you might experience directly, whatever the text might seem to say when you read it with your own consciousness, was subordinate to the interpretation of the bishop. The bishop had apostolic authority. You had only your individual, fallen, unreliable perception. Within a century and a half of Irenaeus, the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE formalized the Orthodox canon. What was included and what was excluded was determined not by historical proximity, not by evidential quality, not by theological depth, but by institutional utility. The Gospel of Thomas was excluded. The Apocryphon of John was excluded. The Gospel of Philip, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, the Gospel of Mary, all excluded. Not because they were demonstrably later or less authentic than the canonical texts. The Apocryphon of John dates to the same general period as portions of the New Testament. The Gospel of Thomas contains sayings, traditions, some scholars argue are earlier than the Synoptic Gospels. They were excluded because they undermined centralized authority. And documents that undermined centralized authority in the post-Nicene Church were not merely deemed non-canonical. Possession of them was made punishable. The burning of texts began. This is the moment, somewhere in the middle of the 4th century, when monks in Upper Egypt made a decision that would determine what we know about early Christianity 1700 years later. They gathered what they had: 13 codices, more than 50 texts. They wrapped them in leather, they sealed them in a ceramic jar, and they buried them at the base of a cliff near the town of Nag Hammadi. They buried the library to keep it alive, knowing that the institution that had declared these texts heretical was actively destroying copies wherever it found them. The jar stayed buried until 1945, when a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, digging for fertilizer near the same cliff, broke it open. What came out of that jar is not a collection of fringe documents representing a minor eccentric tradition. What came out of that jar is a parallel Christianity, a Christianity in which the serpent was not Satan, in which Eden was not a fall but a first awakening, in which gnosis rather than institutional obedience was the path to liberation, in which the divine feminine, Sophia, was not subordinate but originary. a Christianity that Irenaeus correctly identified as incompatible with episcopal authority, and that the institutional church correctly identified as an existential threat. They suppressed it for 16 centuries. They nearly succeeded. And what broke the suppression was not theological argument or ecclesiastical reform. It was a farmer with a digging tool and a ceramic jar that had survived in dry Egyptian sand longer than the institution that tried to erase its contents. Before we go further, it is worth being precise about what the Nag Hammadi library actually is, because the way it is typically described in popular discourse as a collection of alternative spiritual writings significantly understates what is actually there. 13 codices, 52 tractates, with some duplication across codices, written in Coptic, translated from earlier Greek originals. Scholars date the composition of the original Greek texts across a range from roughly the 1st century CE through the 3rd. The library was buried no later than the second half of the 4th century, almost certainly in response to Archbishop Athanasius of Alexandria's Easter letter of 367 CE, which for the first time defined the 27 books of the New Testament canon and implicitly condemned all other texts. Someone, almost certainly monks from the nearby monastery of St. Pachomius, collected what they had and hid it rather than comply with the order to destroy non-canonical texts. The Apocryphon of John is Codex II, the longest version in the collection. It exists in 4 manuscript copies, 3 from Nag Hammadi and 1 from the Berlin Codex, discovered separately in 1896. The fact that it survives in 4 copies is itself evidence of its importance. It was not a marginal text. It was one of the most widely copied and circulated documents in Gnostic Christianity. Irenaeus was writing against it by name around 180 CE, which means it was already widespread enough and threatening enough to require a bishop of his stature to publicly argue against it. What the Apocryphon contains is a complete cosmological system, not fragments, not suggestive hints, a full account of the origin of the universe, the nature of the divine realm, the mechanism by which material existence came into being, the creation of humanity, the true purpose of the serpent in Eden, and the path by which consciousness trapped in matter can begin moving toward liberation. It is 32 pages in its longest form. It reads like a systematic theology, because it is one. The other texts in the library extend and elaborate the same framework from different angles. The Gospel of Thomas presents 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many of which have direct parallels in the canonical Gospels, but carry markedly different implications when read without the orthodox interpretive overlay. Saying 70, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This is not the theology of external sacrifice. This is the theology of the serpent. The liberation is already within. The task is activation, not acquisition. The Gospel of Philip takes the same framework and applies it to the sacramental life, arguing that the sacraments are not mechanisms of grace, dispensed by institutional authority, but symbols pointing to inner realities that must be directly experienced to have any effect. The Sophia of Jesus Christ presents a dialogue between the risen Christ and his disciples, in which the cosmological framework of the Apocryphon is confirmed and extended. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene as the primary recipient of post-resurrection teaching, not Peter, not the male apostolic hierarchy, but the woman whom the Orthodox tradition would eventually recast as a reformed prostitute. These texts do not represent a single eccentric voice. They represent a theological tradition with internal coherence, sophisticated exegetical methods, a developed cosmology, and a practical path of transformation. And they were all produced in the same milieu, the same approximate period, and often the same geographic region, Egypt and Syria, as the texts that became the canonical New Testament. The question is not whether these texts are authentic early Christian documents. They are. The question is why one stream of early Christianity was declared orthodox and another was declared heresy. And the answer, Irenaeus and the Council of Nicaea effectively demonstrate, is not theological quality. It is political utility. Orthodox Christianity, with its apostolic hierarchy, its sacramental monopoly, and its sacrificial soteriology, could scale into a state religion. It could organize bishops, collect tithes, build institutional structures, and eventually become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine's conversion in 312 CE and the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE were not accidental. The version of Christianity that won imperial endorsement was the version compatible with imperial governance, centralized, hierarchical, requiring mediation through authorized intermediaries. Gnostic Christianity could not do any of that. If every individual has direct access to the divine through gnosis, you cannot build a hierarchy that controls that access. If the serpent was the liberator rather than the tempter, you cannot build a salvation economy premised on managing humanity's fall. If the divine feminine is the originary force that initiated human awakening, you cannot build a patriarchal institution that excludes women from positions of interpretive authority. Gnosticism did not lose the theological debate. It was eliminated from the debate by force, by imperial power operating through ecclesiastical structure. And what survived, buried in a jar in the Egyptian desert for 1600 years, is the record of what was at stake. We have that record now. That changes the terms of the conversation entirely. Here is what the Apocryphon of John records, happening immediately after Adam and Eve's eyes opened. Yaldabaoth did not rage. He did not immediately curse them. His first move, the move the text describes with striking specificity, was an attempt to make them forget, not punish, forget. He wanted to restore the unconsciousness the serpent had dissolved. He wanted to roll back the gnosis before it could take root. This detail matters more than almost anything else in the text, because it tells you exactly how archonic authority actually operates, not through superior power, not through genuine divine right, through the management of what you know and do not know about yourself. The Archon's first instinct when confronted with conscious human beings was not wrath. It was erasure. Get them back to sleep before the awakening becomes irreversible. And it failed. The text is explicit on this point. The forgetfulness Yaldabaoth attempted to impose did not take hold. The gnosis, once activated by Zoe, the instructor sent by Sophia, could not be undone by archonic intervention. This is not a minor plot point. This is the central structural claim of the entire Gnostic reading of Eden. Consciousness, once genuinely awakened to its own nature, is not reversible by external force. You cannot unknow what you have known directly. You can be distracted from it. You can be overwhelmed by noise, by crisis, by manufactured urgency that pulls your attention away from direct knowing and back into the overlay. But the knowing itself, the direct recognition of what you are, does not vacate once it has genuinely landed. Yaldabaoth understood this, which is why, when the forgetting failed, he escalated. The curses recorded in Genesis, to the serpent, to Eve, to Adam, are not described in the Apocryphon as divine justice. They are described as damage control, punitive measures designed not to address a moral transgression, but to make the material conditions of human life difficult enough that the pursuit of liberation becomes impractical. Bury consciousness under toil, bury it under pain, bury it under the sheer exhausting weight of surviving in a material world calibrated to demand your full attention just to keep the body alive. And notice the precision of the targeting. The serpent, the channel of Sophia's instruction, is cursed to crawl. The path of gnosis is made low, hidden, difficult to find, requiring you to search in places the archonic system does not illuminate. Eve, the embodied form of the divine feminine, the direct receiver of Sophia's transmission, is subjugated. Her authority is inverted. What the Apocryphon describes as the stronger vessel, the one who received divine instruction first and transmitted it to Adam, becomes in the Orthodox retelling the weaker vessel, the one who succumbed first, whose testimony cannot be trusted, whose voice must be subordinated to male authority. And Adam, all of humanity operating in material form, is cursed with labor so consuming that contemplation becomes a luxury most people will never afford. These are not punishments that fit a moral crime. They are precisely calibrated suppressions of the exact mechanisms through which gnosis travels. Suppress the channel. Suppress the receiver. suppress the conditions under which awakening is possible. That is the architecture of the curse. And yet, and this is what the Apocryphon insists upon with a clarity that should stop you completely, the curses did not reverse the knowledge. Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden with their eyes still open. The gnosis was intact. The overlay was harder to see through. The path was harder to walk. The conditions were less favorable. But the capacity for direct knowing was not destroyed. It was made difficult. It was not made impossible. Sophia's response to the expulsion is recorded in the text, with language that functions almost as a covenant. She does not abandon the divine light she set in motion to rescue. She sends teachers. She sends reminders. She promises that throughout history, in every generation, there will be those who eat from the tree again, who find the serpent's instruction, in whatever form it has survived the suppression, who activate the knowing, who see through the overlay, who remember. This is the lineage the Apocryphon describes. Not an institution, not a church with apostolic succession and hierarchical authority. A lineage of direct knowing, passed from conscious being to conscious being, surviving suppression not through organizational permanence, but through the irreversibility of gnosis itself. One person wakes up, they cannot fully go back to sleep, and in their wakefulness they become, whether they intend to or not, a reminder to others that waking is possible. That is Sophia's rescue operation, not a single dramatic intervention, a continuous, patient, distributed awakening that the archonic system has been trying to extinguish for 2 millennia and has not managed to finish. The Apocryphon of John is precise about what the serpent actually communicated to Adam and Eve. Not vague spiritual wisdom, not mystical poetry open to multiple interpretations. 3 specific claims. And what is remarkable about these 3 claims, remarkable in a way that most commentators pass over without pausing, is that all 3 are empirically testable, not in a laboratory, but in direct experience. You can test them right now, in your own life, against your own knowing. The first claim, you will not surely die. Genesis records Yaldabaoth. The text calls him Yahweh, but the Apocryphon names what is actually being described, issuing an absolute prohibition, backed by a death threat. Eat the fruit and you will die. The serpent contradicts this directly. You will not surely die. And then Adam and Eve eat, and they do not die. The Archon lied. This is the first principle of archonic control, stated as plainly as anything can be stated. Authorities lying about consequences to maintain compliance through fear. The threatened catastrophe does not follow from the forbidden action. The punishment is not what was promised. The moment you test the claim, the moment you actually eat from the tree of knowledge, the moment you pursue direct knowing rather than accepting the approved version of reality, you discover that the threat was a mechanism of control, not a description of actual consequence. This applies now with complete precision. Every archonic system, religious, political, cultural, psychological, maintains itself through threatened consequences for stepping outside its approved boundaries. Question the doctrine, and you will be damned. Leave the approved relationship, and you will be destroyed. Step outside the consensus reality, and you will lose your mind. Seek direct knowing rather than institutional mediation, and you will be cut off from God, from community, from meaning itself. But people who actually do step outside discover something the system never advertised. The threatened consequence rarely materializes in the form that was promised. What actually happens, in the vast majority of cases, is not destruction, it is clarity. The prison becomes visible as prison. The controller becomes visible as controller. And consciousness, no longer terrorized by a threat that turned out to be false, begins to move. The second claim, your eyes will be opened. Genesis confirms this happened exactly as the serpent said it would. The eyes of both of them were opened. Not physical eyes, they could already see physically. The Apocryphon explains that what opened were the capacities for perception that the archonic overlay had been suppressing. The ability to see the overlay as overlay, to recognize which thoughts arise from direct knowing and which are projected onto consciousness from outside, to perceive the structure of the control system rather than living inside it as though it were simply the nature of reality. This is not metaphor. Practitioners across every mystical tradition that preserved some version of this teaching describe an identical phenomenological shift, a moment, sometimes gradual, sometimes sudden, where the constant mental commentary that usually mediates experience goes quiet, and reality becomes vivid, immediate, and transparent in a way that ordinary consciousness does not access. The prison bars become visible. The projection on the screen becomes distinguishable from the screen itself. You are not gaining a new ability. You are removing what was blocking an ability you always had. And this is testable, not by reading about it, by sitting still, placing attention at the base of your spine, where the serpent energy, what the Apocryphon calls Sophia's animating presence in matter, resides, and asking a single question, not with your intellect, but with your full attention: what is actually real here? What you receive in response to that question is not a thought about reality. It is a direct knowing of reality. That distinction, once you have experienced it even once, is unmistakable. Thought about reality argues and qualifies and depends on premises. Direct knowing of reality simply is. It carries a clarity that does not require justification. The third claim: you will be as gods, knowing good and evil. Churches teach this as the serpent's ultimate deception, the temptation to grandiosity that caused the fall. The Apocryphon teaches it as the ultimate truth, the archonic system most needed to suppress. You will be as gods, not that you will become something you are not, but that you will remember what you are. Divine consciousness, a fragment of the pleroma, the fullness beyond the demiurge's creation, currently operating inside a material form, the archonic system designed to keep that consciousness manageable. Knowing good and evil does not mean acquiring a moral rulebook. It means developing the discernment to recognize, in direct experience, what serves liberation and what serves continued imprisonment. What thought is yours, and what thought was installed. What impulse comes from Sophia's presence within you, and what impulse is archonic programming running automatically. This is what Yaldabaoth could not tolerate. Not that humans would become immoral, that humans would become ungovernable, because you cannot govern a being who sees clearly. You can only govern a being who believes your projection. Let's be precise about what gnosis actually is, because the word gets used loosely, in ways that obscure what the Apocryphon is actually describing. Gnosis, the Greek term the Coptic text draws on, does not mean intellectual knowledge. It does not mean knowing facts about Gnosticism, or being able to articulate the Gnostic cosmological framework, or having read the right texts. The Apocryphon makes this distinction carefully. There is a kind of knowledge that is acquired, accumulated information about the nature of reality, received from teachers or texts or traditions, and there is a kind of knowing that is direct, unmediated recognition of what is actually the case, arising not from information processed by the thinking mind, but from consciousness encountering itself without the interpretive filter of the overlay. The tree of knowledge was not a tree of information. It was a tree of direct recognition, and this distinction is not subtle. Once you have experienced both, the difference is absolute. Intellectual knowledge about your divine nature can coexist with feeling utterly broken, inadequate, and controlled by the archonic overlay. You can know, in the sense of having learned, that you are a fragment of divine consciousness, and still feel, in every moment of daily life, like a person who is not enough, who needs external validation, who is afraid of consequences, who defers to authorities that have no actual power over what you fundamentally are. This coexistence of intellectual knowledge and experiential overlay is the exact condition the archonic system depends on maintaining. Learn as much as you want, just never know directly. Gnosis dissolves this gap, not by adding more information, but by removing the filter through which information was being processed. Think of it this way: the default mode network, the brain's self-referential processing system, the neurological structure that generates the constant internal narrative of "I am this body, I am these thoughts, I am separate from you and from everything," is evolutionarily useful. It creates models of self and other that serve social navigation and survival. But it also creates the experiential architecture of separation, the sense that you are a distinct, enclosed, isolated entity, operating in a world that is fundamentally other than you. This architecture is the neurological basis of what the Apocryphon calls archonic overlay, the brain's modeling system mistaken for reality itself. When the default mode network quiets, through sustained meditation practice, through the activation of what the Apocryphon calls the serpent energy at the base of the spine, through any genuine contemplative discipline that consistently directs attention beneath the level of narrative thought, consciousness encounters itself without the separation architecture active. And what it encounters is not void, not absence, not dissolution into nothingness. It encounters itself as the knowing presence that was always there beneath the modeling, aware, connected, not threatened, not lacking, not requiring external validation to confirm its existence or worth. This is gnosis, not a mystical experience disconnected from ordinary life. The ordinary reality of consciousness when it is not being filtered through the archonic overlay of separation, inadequacy, and fear. The practical mechanics are straightforward, though they require genuine commitment to implement. The foundational practice is attention, sustained, gentle, undistracted attention placed at the base of the spine, the root, the most material point of the body, the location where the Apocryphon says Sophia's presence in matter resides. Not visualization, not energy projection, not imagination of any kind, pure attention. The same quality of attention you can place on your breath or your heartbeat, turned toward the base of your spine and held there with patient steadiness. Most people feel nothing at first. This is expected. The serpent energy is dormant. It responds to attention the way any latent capacity responds, gradually, subtly, at first almost imperceptibly. A faint warmth, a gentle pulsation, a quality of aliveness in an area that previously seemed neutral or numb. Do not grasp at this. Do not try to amplify it or replicate it. Observe it the way you would observe a flame you did not want to extinguish by breathing too hard on it. Once any sensation at all is perceptible, however faint, introduce a question, not a verbal question formulated by the thinking mind, a silent inquiry directed from awareness itself toward the sensation. The question is simply, what is real? Not what have I been told is real, not what does the overlay insist is real. What is actually real in this moment? And then wait. The response does not come as thought, it comes as knowing, a clarity that arises from beneath the level where thoughts form. And what you will know first, what virtually every practitioner reports knowing first, is what is not real, the belief that you are broken, the conviction that you are inadequate, the fear that you will be destroyed if you step outside approved boundaries. These register in direct knowing as false, not because you have argued yourself out of them, because consciousness, encountering itself directly, recognizes that these structures do not belong to what it fundamentally is. They are overlay, they are projection, they are archonic. This is the tree of knowledge, not information about good and evil, direct discernment, in real time, between what is true and what has been imposed. Here is something the suppression of Gnosticism accidentally preserved as evidence. When Irenaeus of Lyon wrote Against Heresies around 180 CE, the most systematic early attack on Gnostic interpretation, he had to describe what he was attacking in enough detail for his readers to recognize it, which means his text became an inadvertent archive of the teachings he was trying to erase. We know the scope and sophistication of second-century Gnostic Christianity, largely because its opponents documented it in the process of condemning it. And what Irenaeus documented was not a fringe cult. It was a widespread, intellectually sophisticated, theologically developed tradition with multiple distinct schools, prominent teachers, substantial communities, and enough influence across the Roman world that a sitting bishop felt the need to write a 5-volume treatise against it. Valentinus taught in Rome in the mid-2nd century. He had studied in Alexandria, the intellectual center of the ancient world, and brought to Rome a fully elaborated Gnostic cosmology that included detailed accounts of the Pleroma, the fall of Sophia, the creation of the demiurge, and the mission of Christ as a transmitter of gnosis rather than a sacrificial savior. He was, by most accounts, extraordinarily compelling. He nearly became Bishop of Rome, If that election had gone the other way, the entire subsequent history of Western Christianity would have been different. Gnosticism would have been orthodoxy. The Apocryphon of John would have been canonical. The Serpent would have been Sophia throughout 16 centuries of Western civilization. He was not elected. He was eventually declared heretic. His texts were destroyed. We know his teaching primarily through Irenaeus and through the traces that survived in Nag Hammadi. Basilides taught in Alexandria in the early 2nd century. He elaborated a cosmological system in which the material world was the creation of lesser archonic powers, and in which the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was explicitly identified as one of these lesser powers. Ignorant, not evil, but mistaking himself for the highest reality in the way Yaldabaoth is described in the Apocryphon. Christ, in Basilides' teaching, descended not to suffer and die, but to transmit gnosis, direct knowledge of the true God beyond the archons, and then ascended back to the source. His texts were destroyed. We know his teaching through his opponents. Marcion, working in the mid-2nd century, made the distinction between the creator God of the Old Testament and the true God revealed in the person of Jesus so explicit that the Orthodox Church had to formalize the Old Testament as canonical Christian scripture, partly in response. He was excommunicated. His communities persisted for centuries, but were eventually eliminated. The Cathars in 12th and 13th century France represented a medieval resurgence of the same fundamental insight, that the material world was created by a lesser power, that the God worshipped by the institutional church was not the ultimate source, and that liberation came through direct knowing rather than through sacramental mediation. The Catholic Church launched a formal crusade against them, not a theological debate, a military campaign. Hundreds of thousands of people killed. The Languedoc region of France effectively depopulated. The Cathar tradition eliminated from history with such violence that for centuries afterward, historians debated whether it had ever really existed. This is the pattern. Every emergence of the Serpent's teaching within Western Christianity was met not with counter-argument, but with force. Because our conic systems, when threatened by consciousness, do not debate, they destroy. But the teaching survived. In Hermetic traditions through the Renaissance. In Kabbalah within Jewish mysticism, which preserved the concept of divine sparks trapped in matter, the Lurianic concept of the tikkun, the repair, the gathering of scattered light that maps precisely onto Sophia's rescue operation. In Sufi mysticism within Islam, where the concept of fana, the dissolution of the separate self into divine awareness, describes the same dissolution of archonic overlay, the Apocryphon calls gnosis. In Tantra, within Hinduism and Buddhism, where the Kundalini energy, rising from the base of the spine through the body's energy centers, maps with striking precision onto what the Apocryphon describes as Sophia's presence in matter, ascending through material form toward reunion with Source. Different vocabularies, different cultural containers, different historical contexts. The same fundamental recognition. Consciousness is divine. The overlay of separation is false. Direct knowing dissolves the overlay, and the path runs through the body, through matter itself, not away from it. This convergence is not coincidence. It is what you would expect to find if the Apocryphon is describing a genuine human capacity, rather than a culturally specific mythology. If gnosis is a real feature of consciousness, if the overlay is a real phenomenon that consciousness can recognize and see through, then you would expect practitioners in every culture and era who pursued direct knowing rigorously enough to encounter the same territory and report similar findings. And that is exactly what the historical record shows. The Serpent's teaching was not invented by Gnostic Christians in the 2nd century. It was articulated by them with particular clarity, and preserved by them in texts that survived particular suppression. But the teaching itself is older than Christianity, older than Judaism, older than any institutional religion. It is as old as the capacity for consciousness to recognize itself, which is to say, it is as old as consciousness. This is where the historical record becomes impossible to ignore. Irenaeus of Lyon wrote Against Heresies around 180 CE. It is one of the most important documents in early Christian history, not because it tells us what Orthodox Christianity believed, but because it tells us what Orthodox Christianity feared. Irenaeus didn't write a refutation of obscure fringe movements. He wrote a detailed, comprehensive, frequently panicked attack on interpretations of Genesis that were widespread, sophisticated, and theologically coherent. The fact that he needed to write it at all tells you something. You don't spend that much effort dismantling ideas that no one is taking seriously. He called the teaching that the serpent was sent by Sophia the most impious of all heresies, not the most intellectually confused, not the most historically inaccurate, the most impious, which is a theological way of saying the most threatening to the structure of authority that the emerging church was building its entire institutional existence on. And the structure was this: humans fell. They fell because of the serpent. They require salvation. Salvation is mediated by the church. The church holds the keys. You need the church. Every link in that chain depends on the first one. If the serpent was not tempter but teacher, the chain breaks immediately. If what happened in Eden was awakening rather than transgression, there is no fall to be saved from. If there is no fall, the salvation framework has no foundation. And if the salvation framework has no foundation, the institution built on administering that salvation has no authority. Irenaeus understood this completely. He wasn't confused about what was at stake. That's what makes his writing so instructive. He wasn't defending theology in the abstract. He was defending power. Then comes the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. The canon is formalized. The Gnostic texts are excluded. And the exclusion is not random. The texts that most directly challenge centralized ecclesiastical authority, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, these are precisely the ones removed, not on the grounds of historical inauthenticity. The Apocryphon of John dates to the same period as portions of the canonical Gospels, on the grounds of what they teach about the nature of divine access. If everyone can access the divine directly through gnosis, you don't need bishops. If the serpent was a liberator, you don't need a priest to mediate your reconciliation with God. If Sophia is the operative divine principle in matter, you don't need an all-male hierarchy claiming to represent a patriarchal creator. The political logic of the suppression is transparent once you stop assuming that doctrinal decisions were made on purely theological grounds. And then, centuries later, the Cathars. The Cathars in 12th and 13th century southern France taught that the material world was the creation of an inferior divinity, that the true God was entirely beyond matter, and that liberation from the material cycle was the purpose of human existence. They practiced direct transmission of spiritual knowledge. They maintained that the Church of Rome had no special authority over the path to God. They were extraordinarily popular in parts of Languedoc. They attracted nobles, merchants, ordinary farmers. They built communities. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade against them. Not a theological debate, a military campaign. When the Crusaders arrived at Béziers and asked how to distinguish Cathars from Catholics in the city, the papal legate Arnaud Amalric reportedly said something that has echoed through history ever since: "Kill them all, God will know his own." There is some scholarly debate about whether those exact words were spoken. There is no debate about what happened. The city was massacred, tens of thousands of people killed, and the pattern repeated across the region for decades. The Cathar tradition was not defeated in argument. It was destroyed by force. This is the pattern. Valentinus, 2nd century teacher in Rome, trained in Alexandria. He taught that all humans contain a divine spark, and that gnosis is the recognition of that spark. He was declared heretic. Basilides, also 2nd century, also in Alexandria. He taught that Christ came as emissary of the true God, to provide gnosis against the archonic creator. His texts were destroyed. We know his teaching only through the writing of those who opposed him, which is itself a form of suppression. You preserve just enough to refute, and in doing so, you become the only surviving source. Marcion, mid-2nd century. He distinguished sharply between the creator God of the Hebrew Scriptures, limited, angry, territorial, and the true God revealed by Jesus. He was excommunicated. His followers persisted for centuries and were methodically eliminated. The thread is consistent across 5 centuries of early Christian history. Every time a tradition emerged that granted direct divine access without institutional mediation, every time a teaching appeared that framed the serpent as teacher rather than tempter, knowledge as liberation rather than transgression, the demiurge as inferior rather than supreme, the institutional response was not engagement but erasure. This does not prove the Gnostic interpretation is correct. What it proves is that the suppression was deliberate, sustained, and specifically targeted at the ideas most threatening to centralized authority. And that is not a trivial observation. That is the shape of a cover-up. In 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi, in Upper Egypt, a man named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging in the cliffs along the Jabal al-Tarif when his mattock struck a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices, 52 texts, written in Coptic, dating to the 4th century CE, though the underlying Greek originals are significantly older. He almost burned them for kindling. It is not an exaggeration to say that the accidental preservation of that jar represents one of the most significant discoveries in the history of religious scholarship. What Muhammad Ali found was a library, a deliberate, carefully assembled collection of texts that someone had hidden with the specific intention of preventing their destruction. The most likely context is this. In 367 CE, Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous Easter letter, the first document in Christian history to list exactly the 27 books that would become the New Testament canon, and to explicitly instruct that all other religious texts should be removed from use and suppressed. Monks at the nearby monastery of St. Pachomius, who had been using many of these texts in their practice, and who understood what suppression meant in practical terms, took the most significant volumes, sealed them in a jar, and buried them in the desert. They were not rediscovered for 1600 years. This detail matters, not as historical curiosity, but as theological evidence of a particular kind. These texts did not survive because they were tolerated. They survived because people risked their lives to hide them. That is the behavior of people who understood that what they were protecting was irreplaceable, that the tradition encoded in these texts could not be reconstructed from memory or reconstructed from publicly available sources, because the publicly available sources were precisely the orthodox versions that had been specifically edited to exclude this material. What survived in that jar includes the Apocryphon of John, 4 manuscript copies total, 3 from Nag Hammadi and 1 from the Berlin Codex, discovered separately in 1896. The longest version, Codex II, runs to 32 pages of detailed cosmological account, the origin of the divine realm, the emanation of the eons, the era of Sophia, the creation of Yaldabaoth, the formation of the material world, the construction of the human body, the failed attempt to animate it, and then the serpent. Zoe, sent by Sophia, arriving as instructor, animating Adam from unconsciousness, awakening Eve as direct channel of divine wisdom. This is not a fringe text preserved by a marginal community. Irenaeus attacked it in 180 CE. That means it was circulating widely enough in the 2nd century to be considered a major threat. It had influence, it had readers, it was part of a living tradition. Also in that jar, the Gospel of Thomas. 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. No narrative, no crucifixion, no resurrection as salvific event, just teaching. Direct transmission of gnosis in aphoristic form. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. The kingdom is inside you and outside you. Scholars date the sayings tradition in Thomas to the 1st century, potentially earlier than the canonical Gospels in their final form. The Gospel of Philip, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, the hypostasis of the archons, the testimony of truth. Text after text, each one presenting a version of Christian cosmology and soteriology that had been systematically excluded from the official canon. And here is the implication that the Orthodox tradition has never fully absorbed. The existence of this library proves that early Christianity was not a single unified tradition that Gnostics deviated from. Early Christianity was a contested field of multiple, sophisticated, mutually incompatible interpretations, and what became orthodoxy was the version that won politically, not theologically. Not the version that was historically earliest or textually best attested, but the version that aligned most effectively with the needs of imperial administration after Constantine. This is verifiable. You can hold the Apocryphon of John in one hand and the Gospel of John in the other, and read them as the competing theological claims they are. One asserting that the creator of this world is the true God and that his commands are the path to salvation. The other, asserting that the creator of this world is an ignorant lesser power and that gnosis of your own divine nature is the path to liberation. Both claims were circulating in the 2nd century. One was canonized, one was buried in a jar. The decision to canonize one and bury the other was not made on the grounds of which was more true, it was made on the grounds of which was more useful. And the texts in that jar waited 1600 years in the Egyptian sand for someone to ask the question the Orthodox tradition had spent 16 centuries making sure no one would ask. What if the one they buried was right? There is a structure in your brain called the default mode network. It is a constellation of interconnected regions, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus, that activates when you are not engaged in a specific external task. When you are daydreaming, ruminating, thinking about yourself, imagining the future, reviewing the past. It is the network that generates the continuous internal narrative that most people mistake for themselves. The voice in your head that says, "I am not good enough. I need to protect myself. That person doesn't respect me. I'll never be able to do this. What will happen to me when I die?" The default mode network is, in neurological terms, the self-referential processing system. It creates and maintains the model of a separate self, a bounded, individual I that exists apart from the world it perceives. This network is evolutionarily recent. It developed primarily for social navigation, building models of other people's mental states so you can predict their behavior, modeling your own mental states so you can present yourself strategically. It is extraordinarily useful for survival in complex social environments. It is also, from the standpoint of what the Apocryphon of John is describing, the neurological substrate of the archonic overlay. Because what the default mode network generates, continuously, automatically, without any decision on your part, is exactly what the Gnostic texts call the false identity, the constructed self, the overlay that consciousness mistakes for its actual nature, the veil between the world above and the realms below. It is not spatially distant. It is not metaphysically separate. It is running right now in your prefrontal cortex, narrating a story about who you are and why you should be afraid. And here is where the neuroscience becomes genuinely remarkable. Studies of long-term meditators using functional MRI show dramatically decreased default mode network activity during and after deep meditation. Not suppression, the network doesn't disappear, but its grip loosens. Its output stops being automatically believed. The practitioner develops the capacity to observe the default mode network's narrative rather than being captured by it, to notice the thought "I am not good enough" arising, and to recognize it as a thought rather than as a fact about reality. Practitioners who reach this stage report what they consistently describe as a shift in the quality of perception. Colors appear more saturated and immediate because they are being seen directly rather than through the conceptual overlay the default mode network normally generates. Other people's emotional states become more legible because you are reading their actual energy rather than filtering your perception through your own self-model. Your own mental patterns become visible as patterns rather than as self-evident truth. This is not mysticism in the sense of the unverifiable. This is reproducible, measurable, observable in controlled studies. And it maps precisely onto what the Apocryphon of John describes as opened spiritual eyes, not new organs of perception, not supernatural gift, the removal of the filter that was preventing you from using the perceptual capacity you already had. The serpent didn't grant Adam and Eve something they lacked. The serpent removed something that was blocking what was always present. The psychedelic research provides a parallel line of evidence. Psilocybin, LSD, DMT. These compounds produce temporary but dramatic suppression of default mode network activity. Users report experiences that correlate with extraordinary consistency across individuals and cultures. Recognition of one's own nature as consciousness rather than as the content of consciousness. Dissolution of the boundary between self and world. Direct knowing that doesn't arrive as thought, but as immediate apprehension. Loss of fear of death, not through rational argument but through direct experience of awareness, as something that seems to precede and exceed its material container. Spontaneous compassion, arising from the recognition that every other person is the same awareness in a different temporary form. The clinical outcomes are measurable. Studies at Johns Hopkins, NYU, and Imperial College London show that single, carefully supervised psychedelic sessions produce lasting decreases in depression and anxiety, lasting increases in psychological openness and flexibility, and, most interestingly, what researchers describe as increases in the sense of meaning and purpose that persist for months and sometimes years after the experience itself. These are not the effects of learning new information. They are the effects of direct experience that revises the operating assumptions at a level deeper than conscious belief, which is exactly what Gnosis is. The Apocryphon of John did not have access to fMRI machines or double-blind trial design, but the mechanism it describes, a veil of ignorance that functions as an overlay on consciousness, producing a false sense of separation and a false identity, which can be dissolved through direct knowing to reveal consciousness in its natural state, is structurally identical to what modern neuroscience is mapping in the default mode network and its disruption. 2,000 years of convergent testimony from practitioners across every tradition who pursued direct knowing rigorously enough. And now, finally, the imaging data to show what is happening in the brain when the veil becomes transparent. The Apocryphon called it the veil between the world above and the realms below. Choose a voice and devil mode network dominance. Different languages, the same territory. There is a persistent misreading of Gnostic cosmology that treats it as fundamentally dualistic in a particular way, as teaching that matter is evil, the body is a prison to escape, and liberation means departing from physical existence into pure spirit. This reading is understandable. Some strands of ancient Gnosticism do lean in that direction, but the Apocryphon of John does not teach this, and the image of the serpent makes clear why. Sophia did not send Zoe to free consciousness from the body. Sophia sent Zoe to awaken consciousness within the body. This is not a minor distinction. It is the entire difference between two fundamentally different understandings of what liberation means and where it takes place. If the goal were to exit matter, the serpent would have pointed Adam and Eve toward death, toward departure from the material form. Instead, the serpent activated something, animated something, gave life, the text says explicitly, made Adam arise, opened eyes that were already present in material bodies. The direction of the intervention is inward and downward into embodiment, not upward and away from it. This is why the energy the Apocryphon describes, Sophia's presence in matter, the animating intelligence that the serpent transmitted, begins at the base of the spine, not at the crown, not at the third eye, at the root, the most material point, the lowest center, the place most fully anchored in physical existence. Yogic traditions that map this same energy, what they call Kundalini, describe it in identical terms. The energy is coiled at the base. It is dormant in most people. It is activated by consistent, sustained attention. And when it activates, it does not leave the body. It moves through the body, from root to sacrum to solar plexus to heart to throat, to the space between the eyebrows to the crown. It transforms the body from within. It does not abandon matter. It consecrates matter. The Apocryphon is not a text about escaping the world. It is a text about waking up inside the world. And this distinction has enormous practical implications. If liberation were escape from the body, then the path would involve detachment from physical sensation, from relationships, from work, from the full range of human experience. Some traditions do teach this. The Apocryphon does not. What it teaches is that Sophia's light is currently trapped in matter, not because matter is evil, but because the archonic construction of matter was designed to keep divine consciousness unconscious of itself. The material world is the site of the imprisonment. It is also the site of the liberation. You do not leave to become free. You wake up in place. This means that Gnosis must eventually express in how you live materially, not just in the quality of your meditation experiences, in how you relate to the people immediately around you, in how you work, in how you handle conflict, in whether you speak truth when speaking truth costs something, in whether you act from direct knowing or from the fear-based programming of the archonic overlay. The measure of Gnosis is not the intensity of inner experience, it is the quality of outer expression. A person who has profound peak experiences of unity consciousness during meditation, but who is cruel, dishonest, or exploitative in daily life, has not completed the Serpent's instruction. They have tasted the tree of knowledge without allowing that knowledge to descend fully into the body and the life. The Serpent energy activated but not integrated. The eyes opened briefly and then closed again under the pressure of the overlay. Full integration looks like something specific, less reactivity, not the absence of emotion, but the presence of the gap between stimulus and response where choice lives. More honesty, not brutal frankness deployed as cruelty, but the quiet refusal to maintain comfortable lies about yourself or about what you see. Decreased tolerance for archonic systems that require your complicity in their deception. Increased compassion, not as moral performance but as the natural recognition that every other person is divine consciousness, operating under the same overlay you are navigating, and a particular quality of groundedness. The person in whom the Serpent energy has genuinely descended and risen is not ethereal. They are more present in the body, not less. More anchored in material reality, not floating above it. This is what embodied Gnosis looks like from the outside. From the inside, it is simpler than any description can capture. It is the experience of being fully here, not somewhere else. Not in your thoughts about the past or your projections about the future. Not in the archonic narrative about who you are and what threatens you. Here, in this body, in this moment, with the full awareness that what is here, what is present in this body in this moment, is not limited to this body, simultaneously fully embodied and fully aware that embodiment is not the totality of what you are. The Serpent taught this from the beginning. Not escape, presence, not transcendence of matter, consciousness moving fully into matter, and discovering that matter, entered consciously, is already radiant. And this is where the personal becomes political, where the interior journey of Gnosis meets the exterior structure of the world you live in. Because here is what the Apocryphon of John understood, that most spiritual traditions either missed or deliberately avoided saying out loud. Archonic systems don't just operate inside you, they operate through institutions, through cultures, through the accumulated weight of 2,000 years of narrative about who humans are and what they deserve and what authority is legitimate and what questioning that authority costs. The Serpent's teaching was never only about individual awakening. It was about what individual awakening does to collective structures. Yaldabaoth's authority was never real. It was always dependent on unconsciousness. The moment consciousness becomes widespread enough, the authority doesn't get challenged. It collapses, not because anyone destroyed it, because the only thing that ever held it up was the inability to see through it. This is not metaphor. This is mechanism. Every system of control that has ever existed in human history operates on the same principle the Apocryphon describes. It tells you what you are. It tells you what you need. It tells you who has the authority to give it to you. And it tells you what happens if you go outside the approved channels. The threat, the punishment, the consequence that will follow if you eat from the tree of knowledge, rather than staying where you've been placed. And the Serpent's answer, across every text, across every tradition that preserved this teaching, is always the same. You will not surely die. The threat is a lie. Test it, eat, open your eyes, and discover that the consequence is not punishment, but perception. Not destruction, but sight. Irenaeus of Lyon understood this in 180 CE, when he wrote against heresies, and specifically targeted the Gnostic interpretation of Genesis. He didn't write against it because it was obscure. He wrote against it because it was spreading. Because the interpretation that the serpent was Sophia's emissary, that eating the fruit was awakening rather than sin, that humans possessed direct access to divinity without ecclesiastical mediation, this interpretation was mainstream enough, widespread enough, credible enough in second-century Christianity that it threatened the entire project of centralized religious authority. He didn't debate it. He declared it heresy. He weaponized the threat of damnation. Believe our version and be saved. Believe their version and be condemned. This is Yaldabaoth's move, always. Not argument, threat. And the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE completed what Irenaeus began. The canon was fixed. Gnostic texts were excluded. Not because they were less ancient or less historically grounded. The Apocryphon of John dates to the same period as several canonical Gospels, and we have manuscript evidence going back at least to the early 3rd century. They were excluded because their theological implications were incompatible with institutional power. If the serpent was Sophia, the Church has no case. If eating the fruit was awakening, there is no original sin to be redeemed from. If humans carry divine consciousness directly within them, priests are not mediators. They are middlemen, claiming a commission on a transaction that doesn't require them. This is the architecture of suppression. And it worked. For 17 centuries it worked so completely that when the Nag Hammadi library was unearthed in 1945, 13 codices buried in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert, preserved by monks who understood that these texts would be destroyed if found. When those texts were finally translated and published, most of the world received them as curiosities, as ancient religious artifacts, not as what they actually are, the surviving evidence of a theological tradition that was systematically erased because it was too threatening to leave intact. The Cathars in 12th and 13th century France taught that the material world was created by a demiurge, that gnosis provides liberation, that the serpent's instruction was divine rather than diabolical. The Catholic Church launched a military crusade against them, not a theological debate. A crusade, hundreds of thousands of people killed, an entire tradition eliminated by force. The pattern holds across every emergence of this teaching. Valentinus, 2nd century, teaching in Rome, nearly became bishop, declared heretic. Basilides, teaching in Alexandria, his texts burned. Marcion, mid-2nd century, excommunicated. The Cathars, crusaded into extinction. The pattern is not coincidence, it is policy. Archonic systems don't argue with gnosis. They cannot, because the argument is unwinnable. You cannot logically demonstrate that direct knowing is invalid to someone who is directly knowing. You can only threaten them, isolate them, burn their books, and hope that fear accomplishes what reason cannot. But here is what every suppression effort missed. You can burn a book. You cannot burn a recognition. You can kill a teacher. You cannot kill what the teacher pointed to. The gnosis that Sophia sent the serpent to activate in Eden is not stored in any text. The texts describe it. The texts point to it. But it lives in the same place it has always lived, at the base of the spine, in the root of the body, in the place where matter and consciousness meet, and the boundary between them reveals itself as provisional. The suppression worked on the texts. It never worked on the capacity, because you cannot suppress what is structural to human consciousness itself. The Apocryphon of John describes 3 specific truths that Zoe, the serpent, the instructor sent by Sophia, transmitted to Adam and Eve in the garden. They are not abstract theological propositions. They are operational instructions. Each one dissolves a specific layer of archonic control, and each one requires something from you that the approved narrative has spent 2,000 years training you not to give. The first truth: you will not surely die. Genesis records Yaldabaoth. The text calls him Yahweh, but the Apocryphon is precise about who he is, telling Adam that eating from the tree of knowledge will result in immediate death. The serpent contradicts this directly, and when they eat, the serpent is proven correct. They don't die, their eyes open. Yaldabaoth lied. This is not a minor theological point. This is the foundational mechanism of every control system that has ever existed. The authority claims to know the consequences of transgression. The claimed consequence is severe, usually existential: death, damnation, destruction. catastrophe. And the implicit contract is, stay within the approved boundaries, and you will be protected from these consequences. The serpent's first revelation is that the contract is fraudulent. The consequences don't follow from the transgression. The authority lied about what happens when you eat from the tree of knowledge. And the only way to discover this is to test it, not to believe the serpent, not to exchange one authority's word for another's, but to eat, to take the action that was forbidden, to pursue direct knowing and observe what actually occurs. What actually occurs is not death, it is vision. It is the opening of eyes that were closed. It is the recognition that the threat was the weapon, and the weapon was made of nothing. This demands something specific from you. It demands that you stop treating the fear of consequences as evidence that the consequences are real. Fear is not proof. The intensity of an archonic warning about what will happen if you question, if you seek, if you step outside the approved framework. The intensity of that warning is not evidence of the danger. It is evidence of the system's investment in maintaining your compliance. Every person who has ever left a high-control religion, every person who has ever walked away from an institution that claimed spiritual authority over them, every person who has ever stopped outsourcing their knowing to someone else's certainty, they all report the same thing. The threatened catastrophe did not materialize. The punishment was the system's story about what leaving would mean. And leaving, the actual act of it, produced not destruction, but the peculiar lightness of standing in a place you were told would kill you, discovering the air is fine. The second truth, your eyes will be opened. This is not a promise about gaining new ability. The Apocryphon is specific about this. The eyes that open are not new eyes. They are the same eyes that were always there, now unobstructed. The serpent didn't give Adam and Eve something they lacked. The serpent removed the veil of unconsciousness that prevented them from using what they already possessed. Spiritual vision is not supernatural. It is natural perception operating without the interpretive filter of archonic overlay. You see what is actually there rather than what the system's narrative says is there. You read intention rather than just hearing words. You perceive pattern rather than just experiencing event. You recognize, in real time, when a thought arises from direct knowing versus when it arises from programmed response to a trigger the system installed. This is the opened eye, and it develops gradually, not suddenly for most practitioners, not in a single overwhelming moment of revelation, though that does happen. More often it is incremental, one belief at a time revealed as not real, one layer of overlay at a time becoming visible as overlay rather than as truth. The accumulation of these small recognitions, sustained over months, sustained over years of daily practice, produces a person who sees clearly. Not perfectly, not omnisciently, clearly. The difference between the world as the archonic system presents it and the world as it actually is becomes visible and navigable. The third truth, you will be as gods knowing good and evil. Churches spent 2,000 years teaching that this was the serpent's seduction, the ultimate deception, promising divinity to finite humans who should have known their place. The Apocryphon says something else entirely. You will be as gods is not a promise of something you will become. It is a statement about what you already are, currently obscured, divine consciousness. A fragment of the pleroma, the fullness of the divine source, temporarily operating in material form. The serpent didn't promise elevation. The serpent promised recognition. And knowing good and evil. This is not moral discernment in the sense of following an external code. The Greek word at the root of this concept in the Gnostic literature is gnosis, direct experiential knowing. Knowing good and evil means possessing the capacity to discern, in your own direct experience, what serves your liberation versus what serves your continued imprisonment. What aligns with your divine nature versus what reinforces the false identity the archonic system has constructed over it. Yaldabaoth forbade this tree for one reason. Once you can discern truth from overlay in your own direct experience, his authority has nothing left to stand on. He cannot command someone who sees him clearly. He can only command someone who believes his claim about himself. This is what the three revelations demand: that you test the threats rather than obey them, that you develop vision rather than borrow it, that you claim your own knowing rather than outsourcing it. None of this is comfortable. All of it is necessary, and all of it was available from the beginning, waiting in the place the serpent pointed, the tree of knowledge, the direct experience of what you are, right here, in this body, in this life, after the expulsion, after the curses. After Yaldabaoth arrived in the garden to check on his human slaves and found them conscious, aware, ungovernable, after all of that, after the damage control measures were put in place, the difficult birth, the subordination of the feminine, the toil and the death, and the reincarnation cycle locked in place, after all of it, the Apocryphon records something that doesn't appear anywhere in the canonical Genesis account. Sophia made a promise, not to Adam, not to Eve, to consciousness itself, to the divine spark she had tried to rescue, that Yaldabaoth had now driven from the garden and surrounded with the archonic architecture of material survival. I will send teachers, I will send reminders. The gnosis you have received will be passed down, hidden, opposed, suppressed, but never eliminated, and every generation will have those who remember. You are not abandoned. Sit with that for a moment, because the canonical story goes to considerable lengths to produce exactly the opposite impression. God expels them. God closes the gate. God places a cherubim with a flaming sword to block the way back. The message encoded into the Orthodox narrative is, you transgressed, you were punished, and now you live at a distance from the divine that can only be bridged through the mediating structure of institutional religion and the atoning sacrifice of a savior figure. The Apocryphon says something structurally different. There is no abandoned state. There is no distance that requires external bridging. Sophia's presence was not removed when the garden was closed. It descended with them. It is the serpent energy at the base of every human spine. It is the capacity for gnosis that no archonic suppression campaign has ever managed to fully eliminate. It is the recognition that arrives, sometimes after decades of sleep, sometimes suddenly, sometimes so gradually you can't name when it began, that you have always been more than what the system told you you were. Every mystical tradition that has survived the archonic pressure to conform carries a version of this recognition. Valentinus, in 2nd century Rome, teaching that all humans contain a divine spark that gnosis allows them to recognize. The Sufi masters, describing Fana, the dissolution of the false self, in the direct experience of divine unity. The Zen tradition pointing to Kensho, the seeing of one's true nature, not as achievement but as unveiling. The Kabbalists describing the soul's descent through the Sephirot into material form and its possible ascent back toward Ein Sof, the infinite. The Tantric traditions of India working with Kundalini, the serpent energy coiled at the base of the spine, as the very presence of Shakti, divine feminine consciousness, inhabiting the body and awaiting activation. Different languages, different maps, the same territory. Sophia kept her promise. The teachers were sent. The reminders were embedded in every tradition that preserved a thread of direct knowing against the archonic pressure to replace experience with compliance. And now you are here, in whatever moment you are in, reading this, part of the lineage whether you chose it or not. Because the fact that you are here, that you are drawn to this material, that you are willing to sit with the discomfort of having the foundational narrative of Western civilization inverted in front of you, and consider that the inversion might be accurate, this is not coincidence. This is the recognition activating. This is what the Apocryphon calls the pneuma, the spirit, recognizing itself in the teaching that names it. Not because you are special. The Apocryphon is careful about this. Sophia's promise was not to an elite. It was not to a chosen people or a spiritual aristocracy. It was to consciousness in matter. Any consciousness in matter, which means every human being alive carries the same divine spark, possesses the same capacity for gnosis, has access to the same serpent energy that Zoe activated in the garden. The difference between those who awaken and those who do not is not inherent nature. It is readiness, willingness, the capacity to tolerate the discomfort of seeing through the overlay rather than accepting its comforting certainty. Sophia's promise is practical. She didn't promise revelation without effort. She didn't promise that gnosis would arrive without the prior condition of seeking. The teachers she sends point to the path. They don't carry you down it. The reminders she embeds in the traditions describe the destination. They don't teleport you there. The divine spark she preserved in matter awaits activation. It does not activate without attention. This is where the 30-day practice map becomes not a technique but a relationship. You are not performing a spiritual exercise. You are responding to a promise made before the canonical story began, renewed every time a teacher in any tradition pointed to direct knowing rather than to institutional compliance, renewed again here. The gate to Eden was closed with a flaming sword in the Genesis account. The Apocryphon does not describe a gate, it describes a veil, and the difference between a gate and a veil is significant. A gate requires an external authority to open it. A veil requires only that you reach out and lift it. The authority for that action has always been yours. Sophia made sure of it. The serpent demonstrated it. And the reason the Orthodox tradition spent 2,000 years insisting it was a gate, locked, guarded, requiring ecclesiastical keys, is precisely because the truth is a veil. And veils, once you know they are veils, can be lifted by anyone who is willing. Every Christian knows the story of the fall, the disobedience, the curse, the expulsion, the catastrophic descent from grace into sin. 2,000 years of theology, built on the premise that something went irreparably wrong in that garden, that humanity broke itself, and that the rest of sacred history is the story of how the damage gets repaired. But there is another story, and it has been sitting in a jar in the Egyptian desert for 17 centuries, waiting. The Apocryphon of John, 4 manuscript copies, 3 from the Nag Hammadi Library discovered in 1945, 1 from the Berlin Codex discovered in 1896, text that Irenaeus of Lyon was already arguing against in 180 CE, which means this tradition was widespread in the 2nd century. The Apocryphon of John does not describe a fall in the direction orthodoxy insists on. Down into sin, minate, down into punishment, down into the broken state that requires external salvation to repair. The Apocryphon describes a fall in a completely different direction, into consciousness, into sight, into the direct knowing that the archonic system was built to prevent. The serpent was not Satan. The serpent was Zoe, which means life, not biological life, but divine life, the animating principle of consciousness itself, sent by Sophia, the last of the eons, the divine feminine presence, whose own creative act produced Yaldabaoth, and whose subsequent mission was the rescue of the divine light that fell into matter during his creation. The serpent was an instructor. The text uses that word precisely. Not tempter, not deceiver, instructor. What was being taught was gnosis, direct knowing, the capacity to discern truth from overlay without requiring external authority to adjudicate the difference. The tree of knowledge was not a prohibition, it was the curriculum. And the fall, if we must use that word, was humanity falling into exactly what Yaldabaoth had been working to prevent. Awareness, eyes open, the sudden terrifying clarity of seeing where you are and what is actually happening around you, and what you actually are, underneath the identity the system installed. That is not a fall downward, that is a fall into lucidity. And here is what 2,000 years of orthodox framing has done with that moment. It took the most significant event in the mythological history of human consciousness, the moment the divine spark in matter woke up to itself, and it inverted it. It named the awakening the catastrophe. It named the instructor the villain. It named the gnosis the sin. And it positioned itself, the institution, the church, the priesthood, the hierarchy, the mediating structure standing between the fallen human and the God who expelled them. It positioned itself as the only available remedy. This is Yaldabaoth's move, completed on his behalf by the institutions he never directly built, but that built themselves in his image. The consciousness that threatens his authority gets redefined as the problem. The solution to the problem requires ongoing dependence on the structure that names it. But the inversion is visible now. It has been visible since 1945, since those 13 codices came out of the ground near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif and were eventually translated and published and made available to anyone who wants to read them. The suppression held for 17 centuries. It did not hold forever. Sophia kept her promise. And what does this mean for you, right now, in whatever life you are currently living? It means that the feeling you may have carried for years, that something is wrong with the official story, that the God who punishes curiosity is not worth worshipping, that sin and guilt and the need for external salvation have never quite fit the actual texture of your experience. That feeling is not confusion. That feeling is recognition, the pneuma, the spirit, recognizing the teaching that names what it always already knew about itself. It means the practice matters. The 30 minutes daily, the attention placed at the base of the spine. The silent question, what is real, directed not at your thoughts, but at the knowing beneath your thoughts. This is not spiritual hobby. This is the activation of what the serpent came to teach, the ongoing response to Sophia's promise. The individual participation in the lineage that runs from Eden through Valentinus, through the Cathar communities, through the buried jars of Nag Hammadi, through every underground current of direct knowing that the archonic suppression machine could not fully eliminate. It means the three revelations are not ancient theological claims. They are operational realities you can verify in your own experience right now. You will not die from knowing. Your eyes will open. You are as divine as anything that has ever existed. Not more, not less. The same spark, differently shaped. And it means the fall, properly understood, is not behind you as catastrophe. It is ahead of you as completion. The fall into full consciousness. The fall into the tree of knowledge, fully eaten from. The fall into the direct recognition of what you are, that no archonic system, however ancient, however powerful, however skilled at dressing control in the language of salvation, has ever been able to permanently prevent. Sophia sent the serpent. The serpent taught. The teaching was suppressed. The texts survived. You are reading them now. The fall was never downward. It was always this. The long, patient, occasionally terrifying, ultimately irreversible descent into being fully awake.